Picture London in the 1700s, a city pulsing with candlelight chatter and the faint sound of someone betting on something absolutely ridiculous. The Georgian era was a time of elegance and excess, of empire and etiquette, and yet, beneath the powdered wigs and embroidered waistcoats, a feverish addiction spread faster than gossip in a drawing room: gambling. To the Georgians, gambling wasn't just a game, it was life performance art. Every coin tossed on a table was a declaration of identity, a glittering symbol that said, "I am rich enough to lose this and possibly everything else by Tuesday." England was by this point one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. The aristocracy was fat on colonial profits, the middle class was rising, and the poor were still being crushed by the same taxes that funded everyone else's fun. What better way to pass the time than to set fire to your fortune with style? Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The streets echoed with opportunity. Inside coffee houses, the social media platforms of the 18th century, men in wigs debated politics, philosophy, and which horse might win at Newmarket. Cards were shuffled, dice rolled, and within moments, fortunes shifted hands so fast they made bankers sweat. Gambling had become both entertainment and social currency. You didn't just gamble for money, you gambled for status. The higher your stakes, the more respect you commanded. Risk was the language of power. But where did this mania come from? England had always loved a wager. Even in medieval taverns, men bet on dogfights and dice games. But the Georgian period perfected the art of losing money with dignity. The Enlightenment had brought science, progress and rational thought, but in the gambling dens of London, reason had packed its bags and left the country. This was an age where otherwise intelligent people believed fortune was a lady who could be seduced with enough golden charm. And oh, what a lady she was. She favoured the daring, teased the desperate, and abandoned the faithful. The phrase luck of the draw might as well have been national philosophy. The Duke of Cumberland could lose a small fortune at hazard, shrug, and order another glass of port. A merchant could risk his family business over a game of whist, convinced that this time the dice owed him something. Spoiler, they never did. In Georgian society, gambling tables were the great equaliser. They didn't care whether you were noble or nouveau-riche, smart or spectacularly foolish. Everyone rolled the same dice. In theory, a commoner could bankrupt an earl overnight, though in practice it was usually the other way around. The wealthy had the luxury of losing. The poor had the privilege of watching. But let's not forget the atmosphere. These weren't grim dens of addiction, at least not at first glance. Gambling houses were palaces of decadence, chandeliers glimmering, silk dresses swishing, servants gliding between tables with brandy decanters and quiet judgment. Every laugh was laced with tension. Every glance across the table was half flirtation, half psychological warfare. Winning required charm as much as skill. Losing required grace, and occasionally selling your coach. London's elite embraced gambling as a test of character. A gentleman who lost well was admired. A man who won too aggressively was considered vulgar. There were rules to this madness, unspoken codes of honour that somehow made financial ruin look respectable. Losing thousands of guineas, tragic. Losing your composure, unforgivable. It was a world where emotion was more dangerous than debt. And so the addiction flourished. By the 1750s, gaming tables were as common in the West End as taverns were in the East. You could lose your inheritance before dinner, attend the opera and pretend everything was fine, all in one night. The thrill wasn't just in winning, it was in the sheer risk. Georgian society was built on uncertainty. Political intrigue, colonial ventures, volatile markets. Gambling simply mirrored the world around them, a miniature economy of chaos. Of course, there were critics. Preachers condemned gambling as moral decay, pamphleteers warned of the nation's downfall, and moralists wagged their fingers. but the more they scolded, the more the dice rolled. If gambling was a sin, it was a very fashionable one. Everyone from dukes to debutantes was doing it. Even royalty couldn't resist a round of cards, because nothing says divine right like betting the crown jewels on a flush. The beauty of Georgian gambling was its contradiction. It was both refined and reckless, intellectual and idiotic. It turned rational thinkers into hopeful fools, and fools into legends. A man could win a mansion before supper and lose it before dessert. Entire fortunes disappeared in the time it took to pour a glass of sherry. And yet, they adored it. Because at its heart, gambling represented something deeply Georgian, the belief that life itself was a wager. The empire was built on risk, trade, exploration, war, invention. Gambling simply distilled that spirit into a table, a deck of cards, and a heartbeat pounding beneath powdered silk. The Georgian gamble wasn't about greed. It was about the illusion of control, the idea that luck could be managed with charm, wit, or a very lucky waistcoat. And so they played, night after night, chasing fortune through candlelight and smoke, convinced that the next roll, the next card, the next toast would make everything right again. It rarely did, of course, but if you were going to lose everything, at least you did it while looking fabulous. Before the casinos, before the chandeliers of Mayfair, before dukes were bankrupting themselves over a single hand of Pharaoh, gambling in Britain was born in a cup of coffee. That humble, jitter-inducing beverage was the gasoline that fueled one of the most bizarre social revolutions in 18th century Europe. Welcome to the Georgian Coffee House, the original social network, where fortunes, friendships, and reputations brewed stronger than the coffee itself. Imagine rooms packed with the smell of roasted beans, tobacco smoke, and ambition. Here, merchants rubbed elbows with poets, politicians argued with printers, and somewhere between the pamphlets and the percolators, someone was always whispering, "Care to make a little wager?" It started innocently enough. Coffee houses were the great equalizers of Georgian England. For the price of a penny, you could sit among the city's thinkers, gossips, and schemers. It was a place where ideas were exchanged, and so were debts. But coffee does strange things to the mind. It sharpens wit, quickens speech, and gives men the dangerous illusion that they are both clever and invincible. The combination of caffeine and confidence was catastrophic. Soon wagers began appearing between sips. Who would be elected next? Which ship would reach port first? Would the weather hold? Would the waiter drop the tray? Every moment was an opportunity for a bet. The energy inside these establishments was electric, in the way that lightning striking a haystack is electric. You had Lloyd's Coffee House, where men bet fortunes on whether ships would return from the Caribbean. That small circle of caffeinated gamblers accidentally invented the modern insurance industry. They weren't planning to change global finance. They were just trying to make a few coins off maritime disaster. But that's the Georgian spirit. If it moves, bet on it. If it sinks, bet harder next time. Meanwhile, other coffee houses specialised in politics, publishing, or scandal. At Jonathan's Coffee House, stock jobbers, or the early stockbrokers, screamed at each other about share prices, founding what would eventually become the London Stock Exchange. Inside Childs, clerics and intellectuals debated theology over cards. Over at Buttons, writers like Addison and Steele critiqued each other's essays while gambling on literary success. It was a caffeine-fueled carnival of intellect and idiocy, and everyone wanted in. Coffee houses became extensions of Georgian masculinity, public arenas for risk, bravado, and charm. A man could prove his wit, his nerve, and his social standing with a wager. It wasn't enough to talk about boldness, you had to stake something on it. Betting became a shorthand for courage, the Georgian version of a viral challenge. The only difference was, in this one you might lose your house. And oh, how the wagers grew. People bet on political outcomes, duels, marriages, and even deaths. The dead pool, morbid as it sounds, became popular, with men gambling on who in high society would die first. London's elite were basically running a live gossip to graveyard stock exchange. If someone sneezed at dinner, odds were being calculated by dessert. But the real genius of the coffee house lay in its chaos. There were no dealers, no formal tables, no velvet-lined card rooms, just wooden benches and cheap coffee where fortunes changed hands in ink and handshake. Bets were scribbled on receipts, napkins and newspapers. Entire business ventures began as wagers shouted across the room. If you wanted to find someone willing to gamble on anything, a new trade route, a horse, or your self-respect, you came to the coffee house. And as London's population boomed, so did its appetite for risk. Between 1700 and 1750, the number of coffee houses exploded, turning the city into a giant caffeine-powered casino. The government frowned, of course. Moralists called them penny università, where idleness masqueraded as intellect. But the truth was, coffee houses were the beating heart of a nation discovering the thrill of speculation. The beauty, and the danger, was how normal it all felt. Gambling wasn't seen as vice, it was seen as participation in progress. Every bet was a small-scale version of empire building, a gamble on trade, weather, or war. Britain itself was a nation of wagers, colonies were gambles, voyages were gambles, politics was one long game of chance. Betting was simply how the Georgians understood the world, unpredictable, profitable, and occasionally fatal. Of course, not everyone approved. Preachers warned that coffee houses were dens of corruption, filled with men of restless spirits. But those same preachers occasionally stopped in for a quick cup, and naturally, a quick flutter on whether it might rain. Even hypocrisy had odds. Yet as intoxicating as these caffeine dens were, they were also the beginning of a new economic mindset. Risk was no longer something to be feared, it was something to be managed, even courted. Betting blurred into investment. Wagers became contracts. By the mid-18th century, speculation wasn't confined to dice and cards anymore. It seeped into trade, politics and finance, birthing an empire built as much on luck as labour. But at the time, nobody saw it that way. To the average Georgian coffee drinker, life was simply too short and too boring not to gamble. A quiet day without a wager was a wasted one. It didn't matter if the stakes were a shilling or a ship, the thrill was the same. The risk was the pulse of the city. And when the caffeine buzz wore off and the debts came due, well, there was always another coffee house waiting around the corner, another cup, another chance to feel clever again. Coffee might have kept them alert, but it didn't keep them solvent, proof that some awakenings are best slept through. If coffee houses were the playground of the ambitious middle class, then the real theatre of Georgian gambling was found in the grand salons, parlours, and ballrooms of Britain's elite, where fortunes weren't just lost. They were performed into oblivion. Here, gambling wasn't merely entertainment. It was a language of class, a ritual of arrogance, and a glittering public declaration that you were rich enough to tempt fate and still make it to supper. The Georgian aristocracy, already addicted to showing off, found in gambling the perfect outlet for their competitive vanity. The nobility didn't simply attend gaming nights, they orchestrated them. Picture an evening at one of London's grand Mayfair mansions, carriages lined the street, footmen in powdered wigs lit torches, and inside crystal chandeliers illuminated tables of velvet and vice. Perfume filled the air, along with the smell of candle wax, wine and ruin. The upper class prided themselves on being civilized, but at the gaming table, civility stopped at the shuffle. Aristocrats played not only for money, but for reputation. Winning a round of cards wasn't just about taking home guineas, it was about proving that Providence itself was on your side. And when you lost, the correct response was not despair, but a casual, detached chuckle, as if losing a year's income was simply a minor inconvenience, like spilling tea on one's breeches. Games of chance became the heartbeat of high society. Faro, whist, hazard, and lansquenet were the fashionable weapons of choice. Hazard, a fast-paced dice game, was particularly popular with young noblemen who confused recklessness with charisma. It was noisy, unpredictable, and perfect for showing off. A man could go from gallant to destitute in an evening, but at least he had looked dashing while doing it. But gambling wasn't limited to cards and dice. Georgians had an unparalleled talent for turning everyday life into a bet. They wagered on horse races, cockfights, duels, political outcomes, marriages, and even the weather. 10 guineas says it rains before sunset, a gentleman might declare, and because England was England, he'd probably win. There are even recorded instances of bets on how long someone could stay sober at a dinner party. Spoiler, not long. Wagers could be absurd, creative, or downright idiotic. A duke once bet that a raindrop would reach the bottom of a window pane before another. Another nobleman bet he could jump his carriage across a canal, sure, and promptly demonstrated why natural selection occasionally makes exceptions for the wealthy. One gentleman famously lost a wager that he could teach his dog to read Latin. The dog didn't learn, but the story won applause at every dinner table for months. These ludicrous gambles weren't random eccentricities, they were displays of dominance. The more outrageous the wager, the more daring and enviable you appeared. Losing wasn't shameful, failing to bet was. In this glittering ecosystem of risk, even conversation revolved around wagers. No one wanted to discuss politics or poetry when they could bet on who'd fall asleep first at supper. High society's obsession with gambling wasn't only about money, it was about emotion. The aristocracy, cushioned by wealth and privilege, sought something their comfort denied them: excitement. The thrill of the turn, the gasp of the crowd, the exquisite tension between gain and ruin. It was intoxicating. These were people born into certainty, and they craved danger like the rest of us crave dessert. Gambling was their rebellion against boredom, their attempt to feel alive. At Brooks's Club and White's, two of the most exclusive gentlemen's establishments in London, gambling reached theatrical levels. These were not smoky dens of vice, but marble-floored temples of self-destruction. Members arrived in silk coats, exchanged pleasantries, and promptly began wagering each other into destitution. White's even kept a betting book, a ledger of wagers so absurd it reads like a Georgian fever dream. Members recorded bets about political scandals, duels, royal marriages, and even when certain people might die. One entry casually noted a bet on whether a man would live through the week. He didn't. Someone collected. The betting book became legendary, a combination of gossip column, financial ledger, and black comedy. Every outrageous entry was proof that the English upper class could find humour in the apocalypse, at least until the bills arrived. Women too joined the fun, though with more societal risk. Fashionable ladies hosted gambling soirees where diamonds sparkled, tempers flared, and debts quietly destroyed reputations. But that's a tale for later. For now, suffice it to say that Georgian women were every bit as skilled at turning chance into social spectacle. Among men, gambling became a code of identity. To refuse a wager was an act of cowardice. To win too eagerly was gauche. A gentleman was expected to gamble with composure, win or lose, his expression must remain unreadable. It wasn't merely about luck, it was about performance. Cards were an extension of one's charisma. Dice were theatre. And the audience, the audience adored the spectacle of their peers teetering on the edge of ruin. In this culture, debt was inevitable, but disgrace was optional. As long as a man lost with flair, smiling, joking, promising payment, next, he remained welcome at the table. Many noblemen were perpetually on the brink of financial collapse, their estates mortgaged and their creditors circling, but their social calendars remained full. It wasn't how much you lost that mattered, it was how elegantly you lost it. The irony, of course, is that while Georgian aristocrats prided themselves on refinement, gambling revealed their most primal instincts: greed, envy, pride, and panic. Beneath the lace and wit lay the same trembling hands that gripped dice in every tavern across London. They weren't better gamblers, just better dressed. They bet on horses, cards, weather, and each other's sanity. And somehow the house always won, mostly because the house was mortgaged. If the Georgian coffee house was the cradle of Britain's betting habit, then the gaming club was its opulent, overfed adulthood. These were not smoky taverns for the rowdy middle class or shabby corners for dice and gossip. No, these were the glittering dens of London's elite, where the city's most powerful men gathered to drink, duel with cards, and professionally ruin themselves with style. Gaming clubs were born from a peculiar Georgian need to gamble in privacy while being publicly admired for it. High society couldn't very well be seen elbow to elbow with tradesmen at coffee houses. They needed somewhere velvet-lined, candlelit, and steeped in exclusivity, a temple to vanity where only the chosen few could lose everything. Thus, the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's were born. Whites, Brookses, and Boodles became the holy trinity of aristocratic recklessness. Their polished doors opened not merely to members, but to a particular mindset, one that worshipped risk as both entertainment and identity. You didn't join these clubs to relax, you joined to prove you could handle the danger. It was social Darwinism with a butler. Let's start with White's, the oldest and perhaps most infamous. It began innocently enough in 1693 as a chocolate house, a place to sip the exotic new beverage in civilized company. But by the mid-18th century, it had evolved into the beating heart of Britain's gambling elite. The chocolate was soon replaced by wine, then cards, then scandal. The club's interior gleamed with mahogany panels, gilt mirrors, and a pervasive smell of expensive perfume and financial regret. Inside, men in powdered wigs gathered around green felt tables, whispering wagers like conspirators in an economic coup. White's betting book became legendary, a record of the aristocracy's most absurd and occasionally appalling wagers. Members bet on anything from political appointments to births, duels, divorces and deaths. One lord famously wagered £3,000 on which of two gentlemen would live longer. It was less about morbid curiosity and more about turning mortality into entertainment. Death, after all, was the only thing they couldn't buy, so naturally they tried to bet on it instead. The club was divided by politics as well as pride. Tories and Whigs glared at each other across tables laden with cards and port. But when the dice rolled, ideology vanished. Nothing united enemies quite like mutual stupidity. It was a strange sort of equality, the kind only shared by men who'd just lost a carriage to a bad hand. Then there was Brookses. Founded in 1764, the liberal younger brother of White's, less rigid, more flamboyant, and even more ruinous. If White's was the old guard of aristocratic decadence, Brookses was the revolutionary cousin with better taste in waistcoats. It became the Whigs' spiritual headquarters, attracting playwrights, poets, and politicians who liked their philosophy served with champagne. Charles James Fox, a man described by contemporaries as addicted to play as much as to politics, was one of its brightest and most indebted stars. Fox embodied everything about Brooks's culture: witty, charming, perpetually broke. He once lost £11,000 in a single night, roughly equivalent to several million today, and reportedly shrugged it off as one might a spilled drink. Members of Brooks's prided themselves on this kind of elegant despair. Losing money was inevitable, losing composure was unforgivable. Brooks's was notorious for its atmosphere of perpetual motion. Dice clattered until dawn, waiters refilled glasses, and debts multiplied faster than scandal. The great historian Horace Walpole once described it as a nursery for every species of vice. He was correct, but what a beautifully furnished nursery it was. Boodles, meanwhile, was slightly tamer, a haven for the quieter sort of gentleman gambler. It was where those who had already lost too much at White's or Brooks's went to pretend they still had self-control. Think of it as the Georgian version of a cooling-off self-period. But these clubs were more than mere gambling dens. They were centres of power. Politics, gossip, business deals, all unfolded across the same tables where fortunes dissolved. Membership was a passport to influence. To be seen entering Brooks's or White's was to announce to London that you had arrived, or at the very least that you were rich enough to afford spectacular mistakes. The rituals were absurdly strict. Prospective members required multiple endorsements, sometimes even a full vote. A single black ball in the voting box could ruin a man's chances forever, hence the term blackballed. Ironically, the only thing harder than getting into these clubs was getting out, financially speaking. Once inside, the lure of the tables was irresistible. Men mortgaged estates, borrowed against inheritances, and bet their way into infamy. Servants played silent witnesses to their master's downfall. They poured brandy, fetched cards, and discreetly noted who'd be selling their horses next week. Some even made small fortunes selling gossip to the press. London's rumour mills thrived on club scandals, debts, affairs, broken friendships, all whispered from behind silver trays. And yet, despite the ruin, the clubs thrived. The allure wasn't just in the gambling, but in the exclusivity. The Georgian elite needed places to display both their wealth and their recklessness. The clubs were stages, and every card dealt was a line in a performance about power, privilege, and the human capacity for denial. These clubs became so influential that they shaped British culture for centuries. The modern concept of the gentleman's club, from Pall Mall to Mayfair, descends directly from this era. Even politics was moulded here. Decisions that changed empires were sometimes made between bets. Georgian governance, it turned out, was just as much a gamble as Georgian leisure. By the end of the 18th century, London's gaming clubs had become institutions, temples to human folly gilded in gold leaf. They symbolised everything dazzling and destructive about Georgian society: refinement masking ruin, courtesy concealing chaos. Inside those walls, men lost fortunes, reputations, and occasionally consciousness, but never their membership, because true gentlemen paid their dues, even if they couldn't pay their debts. When people imagine Georgian gambling, they often picture men in powdered wigs clutching dice and brandy. But behind the embroidered curtains and beneath the chandeliers, another kind of gambler ruled the night: women of elegance, wit, and terrifying self-confidence. They wore silk gowns that cost a servant's yearly wage and could lose a small country's GDP before supper. If the gentlemen of Whites and Brookses set fire to their fortunes in private clubs, Georgian women did it in public and made it fashionable. Welcome to the world of the female gaming salons, where glitter met greed and social prestige danced a scandalous waltz with ruin. The hostess was queen, the cards were her sceptre, and the guests were her adoring, if financially doomed, courtiers. No one embodied this better than Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, the most dazzling woman of the age. She was beautiful, brilliant, politically connected, and catastrophically addicted to gambling. Her soirees at Devonshire House became the epicentre of high society play. Picture it: candelabras blazing, mirrors reflecting golden light, a symphony of laughter, silk, and deceit. Servants glided through with crystal glasses, while noble women fanned themselves and men tried not to sweat through their waistcoats. At the centre of it all sat Georgiana, the duchess who could charm a room with a glance and bankrupt half of it before midnight. She played Pharaoh, the game of choice for fashionable women, beloved for its speed and apparent simplicity, and despised by husbands everywhere for precisely the same reason. Pharaoh looked elegant, but beneath its refined surface lurked chaos. The house banked the game, players placed bets, and money vanished faster than modesty at a masquerade ball. Georgiana wasn't alone. Across London and Bath, aristocratic women turned their drawing rooms into miniature casinos. The Marchioness of Salisbury, Lady Buckinghamshire, and Lady Archer were infamous for their gaming tables, collectively nicknamed the Pharaoh Ladies. Their salons attracted politicians, poets, officers, and fools who fancied themselves lucky. Even the Prince of Wales occasionally joined in, which was excellent for gossip, but disastrous for everyone's finances. These events weren't just games, they were performances of power. For Georgian women, whose political and economic influence was severely limited, gambling salons offered rare control over their social universe. The hostess decided who entered, who played, who owed, and who was forgiven. Cards were a language of flirtation, manipulation, and negotiation. To play at a lady's table was to acknowledge her authority and risk your estate in the process. Of course, high-stakes gambling required high-stakes fashion. The salons were sensory feasts, powdered wigs towering with ostrich plumes, diamonds glinting in candlelight, the scent of imported perfumes and spilt champagne. Lace sleeves fluttered dramatically as fortunes changed hands. The sound of shuffling cards mingled with sighs of delight and despair. It was elegance wrapped around addiction, a silk glove concealing an iron compulsion. The Georgian press, ever hungry for scandal, devoured tales of these women. Pamphlets circulated with salacious titles like The Pharaoh Lady's Fall and Fashionable Ruin. Satirical prints by artists like James Gilray depicted society women as harpies, vampires and demons feeding on men's purses. One famous caricature shows Lady Buckinghamshire presiding over a card table surrounded by desperate faces, her eyes gleaming with avarice. It was both moral warning and guilty entertainment, because of course the same critics often attended the next salon. And the sums of money involved? Astronomical. Debts ran into tens of thousands of pounds, enough to build a small palace or fund an army regiment. But in the world of fashionable hell, as one contemporary dubbed it, debt was simply another accessory. You could hide it behind pearls and politeness. It was not uncommon for women to pawn jewellery, sell paintings, or quietly beg wealthy relatives for bailouts. In some tragic cases, families were financially wrecked by a single hostess's gaming table. The social consequences were brutal. A man who gambled to ruin was pitied or mocked. A woman who did so was condemned. Society adored watching these women rise and fall, each scandal a new chapter in the ongoing novel of public hypocrisy. The same men who lost fortunes to them would later denounce them as immoral. The double standard was exquisite and entirely Georgian. But make no mistake, these women were not naive victims of chance. They were masters of strategy, social and psychological, if not mathematical. They understood the art of reading faces, of charming confidence from opponents, of turning conversation into manipulation. The best hostesses could keep a table enthralled for hours, weaving conversation, flirtation, and subtle intimidation into one intoxicating spectacle. Even as moralists railed against them, their influence reached the highest levels. Many of these women were deeply involved in political life, using their salons to build alliances and shape public opinion. The Duchess of Devonshire herself campaigned for the Whigs, famously kissing butchers in Westminster to secure votes, a shocking act of political theatre that scandalised her critics and delighted her supporters. To her, cards and politics were simply two versions of the same game. Both required risk, charm, and a poker face. By the late 18th century, however, the tide began to turn. The debts grew impossible to hide. The newspapers turned savage. The public, weary of excess, began to equate female gambling with moral decay. In 1796, police even raided Lady Buckinghamshire's house, confiscating her pharaoh tables, a humiliating spectacle that marked the beginning of the end for the great salons. But for a few glittering decades, these women ruled the night, queens of cards, elegance, and ruin. They transformed gambling from a masculine vice into a fashionable empire, where fortunes were lost to beauty as much as to luck. They played for guineas, they played for glory, and sometimes they played for rent, because even in Georgian high society there's nothing more dangerous than a bored woman with a deck of cards. In Georgian society, gambling was not merely about money, it was about manners. Ruin was acceptable, rage was not. You could lose everything from your townhouse to your family's ancestral silver, but heaven forbid you lose your cool. The currency of Georgian gambling wasn't gold or guineas, it was race. And that grace had to be maintained even as your luck, and possibly your life, slipped away beneath the cards. At the gaming tables of London, the true measure of a gentleman or lady wasn't whether they won, but how beautifully they could lose. Emotional restraint was the golden rule, To show frustration, to curse your luck, to question another player's honesty, that was social suicide. A gambler's table was a stage, and every player was an actor trained in the art of polite destruction. This obsession with composure came from the Georgian cult of honour, that fragile, glittering construct that defined everything from duels to dinner conversation. A person's reputation was their true fortune, far more valuable than estates or jewels. To act with dignity was to affirm one's place in the hierarchy of civilization. Losing money could make you a cautionary tale. Losing your temper could make you an outcast. Consider the paradox. Men could wager away their family estates and be invited to supper the next day. But if they accused another of cheating, they risked a duel at dawn. It wasn't about morality. It was about style. Georgian society worshipped appearance over principle. Gambling etiquette was therefore an elaborate performance of self-control. No matter how desperate or drunk a player became, they were expected to smile, compliment their opponent, and request another round as though their world hadn't just collapsed. The phrase, keeping one's countenance, wasn't a metaphor, it was survival. A trembling hand could betray ruin. A sigh could expose weakness. The best gamblers mastered the art of emotional invisibility. They didn't merely bluff their opponents, they bluffed society itself. Behind the powdered faces and practiced smiles lay an empire of anxiety, held together by the delicate glue of pride. Nowhere was this more visible than in the glittering salons and gentlemen's clubs that defined the age. Inside Brooks's, White's, and Devonshire House, laughter echoed even as debts mounted like storm clouds. The very architecture encouraged serenity. Soft candlelight, smooth mahogany tables, plush carpets to muffle the sound of dropped dice, and occasionally shattered dreams. Servants poured wine and pretended not to notice when a gentleman's hand trembled. The illusion of control had to be absolute. There was an entire code of conduct for gamblers, known informally as play etiquette. A gentleman was expected to never gloat when winning, never sulk when losing, and never renegotiate debts. Promises made at the table were as binding as legal contracts, often more so since breaking them could destroy one's name. A handshake between peers carried more weight than a signed document in court. Honour, once tarnished, was almost impossible to repair. If disputes did arise, and they inevitably did, the solution was rarely civil. A perceived insult, even as small as implying unfair play, could result in a formal duel. Georgian dueling culture and gambling were twin siblings in the theatre of ego. One determined a man's fortune, the other his character. Losing at cards wasn't shameful, being called a cheat was unforgivable. To defend one's reputation, men routinely met in the cold morning air with pistols, all because someone couldn't resist saying, "Are you sure you shuffled properly?" Women were not immune to the pressures of honour, though the rules were twisted against them. A man's composure signalled nobility. A woman's calm under pressure was taken as cunning. Female gamblers were often accused of being manipulative or immoral, yet they too were bound by the same silent demand: never break composure. The Duchess of Devonshire could lose a fortune in public and still smile sweetly as her debts grew monstrous. Her serenity wasn't ignorance, it was armour. Honour extended even into the settling of debts. In a world obsessed with appearances, how one paid was just as important as whether one paid. A man might sell his carriage or art collection, but he must do so discreetly. Public embarrassment was worse than insolvency. Some would borrow endlessly from friends, confident that as long as they maintained their manners, their credit, both financial and social, would remain intact. This strange economy of grace made gambling one of the most psychologically demanding pastimes imaginable. Players weren't only battling luck, they were battling themselves. Every emotion had to be bottled, polished and disguised. The strain was immense. Contemporary letters describe gentlemen quietly weeping behind closed doors after losing entire estates, only to reappear the next day with powdered wigs and perfect smiles. The Georgian gambler lived in a perpetual paradox. publicly charming, privately collapsing. And yet this ritualized restraint was precisely what made gambling so seductive. The table wasn't just a place of risk. It was a stage where one could perform refinement under pressure. It was the ultimate test of breeding. Could you lose everything and still pour your opponent a glass of wine? Those who succeeded gained immense social admiration. To lose like a gentleman was an art form. A well-timed quip could redeem a disaster. One story tells of a nobleman who, after losing £20,000, calmly lit his cigar and said, "I shall dine on philosophy tonight." That single remark made him the toast of the season. Dignity, after all, was the only commodity that held its value. But the cost of this culture was enormous. Beneath the powdered surface, the Georgian world was full of broken families, silent despair, and moral exhaustion, all masked by the smile of civility. The pressure to remain composed was both heroic and cruel. It demanded superhuman restraint in a society built on temptation. In Georgian London, rage was vulgar, despair was unfashionable, and only the quietly ruined were truly respectable. If Georgian society had a national sport, it wasn't cricket or horse racing, it was faro. The game swept through Britain's upper crust like powdered sugar through a wig. Glittery, addictive, and impossible to get rid of. It promised excitement, elegance, and easy winnings. In reality, it was financial quicksand disguised as entertainment. Faro didn't just ruin fortunes, it ruined entire generations, one perfectly dealt hand at a time. To understand Faro's reign of destruction, picture a Georgian ballroom transformed into a battlefield of charm and chance. Candlelight flickered across gold-trimmed tables, the air thick with perfume, tobacco, and tension. Servants glided silently between players carrying glasses of claret. Diamonds sparkled, laughter echoed. And somewhere under all that luxury, desperation quietly gnawed at the edges. Faro was a simple game, deceptively so. It used a standard deck of cards, and players bet on which card ranks would appear next. The dealer, known as the banker, turned cards two at a time, one for the bank, one for the players. If your chosen rank appeared as the player's card, you won. If it came up as the banker's, you lost. Easy to learn, impossible to resist. And like all great traps, it was simplicity that made it lethal. The brilliance and danger of Faro lay in its illusion of fairness. Unlike other card games, players didn't compete against each other, but against the dealer. This gave the impression that the odds were even, that reason and strategy could triumph over luck. They couldn't. The house always had a slight mathematical edge, but that edge might as well have been a cliff. And since most Faro bankers weren't saints, they often enhanced their advantage through various creative means. Marked cards, double dealing, sleight of hand, or, in the case of some professionals, pure theatrical deception. In respectable salons, Faro was the centerpiece of the night. In disreputable gaming dens, it was the black hole at the center of financial gravity. Players crowded around the table, fanning themselves and pretending not to care, while behind them, footmen waited to retrieve empty purses. It was fast-paced, dramatic, and dangerously social. You weren't just gambling money, you were gambling reputation, relationships, and occasionally your sanity. The game's appeal was universal among the elite. It was quick enough for the impatient, glamorous enough for the vain, and unpredictable enough for the delusional. Even those who hated gambling couldn't resist watching Faro. It was a spectator sport of self-destruction. Onlookers whispered behind fans, gasped at outrageous bets, and took quiet delight in seeing dukes and duchesses tumble from fortune to farce before dessert. At the height of the craze, entire nights revolved around Faro. Invitations to gaming soirees read like royal summonses. Her Grace's Faro table will open at 11. Fortunes optional, dignity not required. Tables were covered with green baize cloth, adorned with ivory markers, and overseen by professional bankers who ran the game with the precision of surgeons and the morals of highwaymen. And oh, the money that flowed through those tables. Thousands of pounds could change hands in minutes. People sold land, jewels. and even future inheritances to stay in the game. One noble woman was said to have wagered her family's ancestral estate and lost it before breakfast. Another reportedly staked her diamond necklace, and one only to lose it again within the hour. Faro didn't reward intelligence. It rewarded audacity and punished optimism. But what truly made Faro infamous was its moral and emotional carnage. The game had a way of stripping people down to their rawest selves. Gentlemen who prided themselves on composure found their hands trembling. Ladies of grace and wit sat rigid, masking panic beneath rouge and lace. Husbands lied to wives. Wives lied to creditors. Debts ballooned like opera sleeves. It wasn't uncommon for someone to lose everything and return the next night with borrowed money and renewed delusion. Contemporaries described faro tables as fashionable hells. Even the newspapers picked up the phrase, reporting nightly on the scandals of the aristocracy's favourite pastime. Artists like James Gilray immortalised the craze in savage caricatures. Powdered nobles hunched over cards, eyes wide with greed, surrounded by grinning devils who looked suspiciously like waiters. The message was clear. If you played long enough, the devil himself would eventually claim the house. Yet moral outrage did nothing to slow the frenzy. Faro was too beautiful to hate. The Duchess of Devonshire, Lady Archer, Lady Buckinghamshire, they all hosted glittering Faro nights that mixed luxury and lunacy in equal measure. Even when Parliament attempted to crack down with gambling laws, the upper class simply moved the games behind thicker curtains and added more champagne. The professional Faro bankers were a class of their own. Some were nobles, others social climbers, all united by their extraordinary talent for smiling while cheating. These dealers could control the pace of the game with masterful manipulation, sometimes shuffling cards so subtly that outcomes were predetermined before the first wager was placed. But even when caught, punishment was rare. Accusing a noble of cheating was like accusing a peacock of vanity, technically true, but socially suicidal. The Faro craze reached its peak in the late 18th century, when the game became synonymous with wealth and ruin. One could measure a person's social standing by the quality of the Faro table in their home, and their financial desperation by how often it was in use. Eventually, though, even the Georgians began to tire of watching their peers implode. Faro's reputation soured. It was too public, too scandalous, too efficient at destroying the economy of the aristocracy. By the dawn of the 19th century, Faro tables were closing, replaced by newer fads like whist and lotteries, less dangerous but less thrilling. What remained was the wreckage, broken fortunes, pawned heirlooms, ruined reputations, and a handful of surviving players who claimed they had almost beaten the odds. Almost, but never quite. Because that was Faro's real genius. It convinced you that you were just one card away from redemption. One more hand, one more bet, one more miracle. And then, before you knew it, your future was gone, elegantly, quietly, and with impeccable manners. In the end, Faro wasn't a card game. It was a polite form of financial suicide, served with wine and applause. While dukes and duchesses ruined themselves in candlelit clubs, London's cobblestones echoed with a different rhythm of risk, louder, rougher, and infinitely more inventive. Gambling wasn't confined to the chandelier glow of Mayfair. It thrived just as wildly in the muddy alleys, bustling taverns, and raucous fairs of Georgian England. Here, gambling wasn't a fashionable vice. It was a way of life. To the working class, the wager was both entertainment and escape. A labourer might not own a horse or a waistcoat worth betting on, but he could still risk his week's wages on the next best thing, a fight, a race, a ridiculous challenge no sane person should attempt. The streets themselves became open-air casinos, their currency laughter, bruises, and the occasional dead chicken. The Georgian lower classes were creative gamblers. Without clubs like White's or Brooks's, they turned anything that moved, or sometimes didn't, into a betting opportunity. Dogfights and cockfights were the staples, brutal, bloody, and wildly popular. In every major town, pits echoed with cheers and groans as men crowded around, coins clinking and ale sloshing. A good fighting cock could be worth a month's wages, and its owner treated it like a prize athlete, albeit one that occasionally exploded into feathers. Bear baiting was another spectacle that drew crowds by the hundreds. Despite the protests of early animal lovers, the blood sport remained a national pastime well into the 18th century. At the Bear Garden in Southwark, a massive pit was surrounded by cheering spectators as chained bears faced off against packs of dogs. The bets flew thick and fast. How many dogs would survive? How long would the bear last? It was gruesome, barbaric, and somehow still considered a family outing. Because nothing says Sunday entertainment like explaining to your child why the bear is winning. And yet, for all its cruelty, these events weren't purely about violence. They were about community. Gambling on fights was social glue. A way for labourers, apprentices and tradesmen to bond, vent and forget the harshness of their daily grind. It was camaraderie with consequences. Win, and you were buying the next round. Lose, and you were the next joke. But not all bets involved blood. The Georgian appetite for chance extended into the absurd. People wagered on everything. The weather, the outcome of a trial, the gender of a pregnant neighbour's baby, or whether a chimney sweep could climb a church spire without dying. There are documented cases of bets on how long it would take a man to eat an entire sheep, or whether a fish could survive longer out of the water than a drunk could remain upright. The answer, tragically, was usually neither. The taverns were the real engines of this street-level gambling economy. Every alehouse had its regulars, its dice, and its local champion with a suspiciously good aim. Dice games like Hazard were favourites among the working class, simple to play, impossible to win, and guaranteed to start at least one fistfight before closing time. Wagers on billiards, skittles, and card games like All Fours and Put were equally common. The stakes weren't measured in guineas, but in pints, pride, and occasionally one's boots. Meanwhile, street races became spontaneous public events. Boys raced dogs, drunks raced each other, and carriage drivers raced down narrow lanes at speeds that made pedestrians scatter like pigeons. Gambling followed wherever chaos went. In markets and fairs, people even bet on the speed of snail races. Yes, snail races, proving that boredom was no match for the human imagination. One report from 1773 describes a wager placed on which snail would reach a cabbage leaf first. It took 3 hours. The bettors didn't seem to mind. Gambling was so deeply woven into daily life that even work could become a wager. In the docks, men bet on how many barrels they could lift. In the fields, farmhands challenged each other to drinking contests disguised as productivity competitions. And in the London slums, pickpockets placed bets on who could steal the most in a single evening. The winner buying everyone drinks with his ill-gotten gains. Of course, not everyone approved. The authorities tried to curb the chaos with periodic crackdowns, blaming gambling for crime and drunkenness and moral decay. Pamphlets thundered about the corruption of the common man, warning that wagers led to idleness, vice and ruin. But the moralists missed the point. Gambling was one of the few ways ordinary people could feel in control of their fate. When your life was dictated by landlords, factory owners and weather, a coin toss was a brief taste of power, even if it usually ended in regret. The public fairs were especially notorious for their gambling culture. Events like Bartholomew Fair in London or Nottingham Goose Fair offered games of chance that ranged from honest competition to outright theft. Shell games, card tricks and rigged wheels lured in unsuspecting players. A fool and his money were soon parted, usually by a grinning showman with fast hands and faster feet. And yet people returned every year. The thrill was irresistible. Even religion couldn't fully extinguish the fire. In the same century that saw Methodism rise and moral reform spread, parish priests were known to bet on cockfights for the sake of community spirit. The line between virtue and vice was as thin as a playing card. By the late 18th century, gambling had become the great equalizer. The rich risked estates in polished rooms, the poor risked their wages in muddy pits. The stakes were different, but the psychology was identical. That same electric hope that luck might finally turn in their favour. The same fatal optimism that whispered, "Next time it will be Missy." From dukes to dustmen, everyone was betting on something. And while the rich lost fortunes over cards, the poor lost paychecks over pigeons, proving that stupidity at least was the one truly democratic institution of Georgian England. As gambling spread like wildfire through 18th century Britain, from candlelit ballrooms to the foul-smelling corners of London taverns, a new breed of opportunist emerged, the bookmaker. Half accountant, half con artist, or still, these men stood at the crossroads of order and chaos, clutching their ledgers like holy scripture and shouting odds loud enough to drown out reason. They didn't play the game, they profited from it. And in a nation addicted to risk, that made them very rich indeed. Bookmakers were the middlemen of madness, men who realised that the surest way to win a bet was to let other people make the losing ones. Before they appeared, gambling was largely personal, a clash between friends or foes. You bet a guinea on a race, shook hands, and prayed your opponent didn't vanish into the crowd before paying up. Bookmakers changed all that. They transformed the wager from a gentleman's promise into a business transaction, complete with ink, receipts, and the illusion of legitimacy. The profession began in the smoky arenas of horse racing, that most English of obsessions. By the mid-1700s, racecourses like Newmarket and Epsom Downs had become magnets for gamblers from every class. The aristocracy rode in their carriages, the poor arrived on foot. Horses thundered down the track, crowds roared, and amid the chaos stood the bookmaker, hat tilted, quill ready, ledger open, pockets jingling with other people's misfortune. Their methods were simple but devastatingly effective. A bookmaker would announce odds for each horse, sometimes sensible, sometimes pure fantasy, and take wagers from anyone willing to risk a coin. He'd jot down the details in his ledger with the precision of a monk, but with none of the virtue. At the end of the race, he'd pay out to the winners and pocket the rest. The trick, of course, was that the rest was usually much larger than whatever he owed. Bookmaking wasn't gambling, it was mathematics with swagger. Many of these early bookmakers were colourful characters, equal parts entertainer and predator. They had to be. Racecourse crowds were rowdy, suspicious, and easily distracted. A successful bookmaker needed lungs like a preacher, nerves like a surgeon, and the moral flexibility of a pickpocket. They were masters of persuasion, shouting odds, spreading rumours, and occasionally adjusting the numbers mid-race if the wind seemed favourable. A few rose to near legendary status. One such figure was John Racing Jack Martindale, who supposedly carried his entire fortune in his hat and had a ledger so worn that gamblers treated it like a relic. He claimed to have never lost a wager personally, which was technically true since he never placed one. Others, like the infamous Bill Chadwick, became known for creative bookkeeping, entries written in disappearing ink, or debts suddenly forgotten when the debtor wasn't looking. But for every flamboyant bookmaker strutting across the turf, there were 10 shady imitators lurking behind. The unregulated nature of the trade made fraud almost inevitable. Honest bookie was as contradictory a phrase as sober sailor. Many would vanish after a particularly bad day, only to reappear under new names, new ledgers, and the same grin. And yet, despite their reputation, bookmakers filled a vital niche. They brought structure to chaos. By setting odds and recording bets, they effectively standardized gambling. No more shouting matches about who owed whom. The bookmaker's ledger became the law of the track, a dubious law certainly, but one respected enough that disputes could be settled without bloodshed most of the time. In their own strange way, bookmakers civilized the betting world, turning raw enthusiasm into an early form of financial speculation. Soon their influence spread beyond the racetrack. You could find bookmakers at prize fights, cockfights, political gatherings, and even public hangings. If people were gathered and something unpredictable was about to happen, a bookmaker was never far away. One observer wrote in 1779 that to see a crowd is to see a bet. The bookmakers took that as a business model. Politics itself wasn't immune. During elections, bookmakers set odds on candidates, fueling both gossip and gambling in equal measure. Bets were placed on everything from the outcome of parliamentary votes to the date of a royal birth. In a way, bookmakers became the informal pollsters of the Georgian age, except their predictions came with shouting ale and a 10% commission. The craft of the bookmaker evolved alongside technology. As newspapers expanded, they began printing racing results and, inevitably, betting tips. This allowed bookmakers to extend their reach nationwide. A man in Bath could bet on a horse in Yorkshire, trusting a letter or messenger to deliver the wager, and sometimes, if luck held, the winnings. More often he simply received silence. And of course, wherever there was money, there was moral panic. Clergymen and pamphleteers denounced bookmakers as parasites feeding on the nation's vice. Parliament debated banning them outright, though several members were quietly using their services. "The bookie," wrote one moralist, "is the devil's accountant." The devil, if he existed, was almost certainly impressed. The real irony is that bookmakers, those loud-mouthed villains of Georgian sport, would eventually lay the foundation for modern finance. Their ledgers, odds, and risk calculations were primitive versions of statistical probability and market speculation. In trying to organise chaos, they accidentally invented the idea of the odds market, the ancestor of stock exchanges and insurance tables. In short, today's bankers owe their existence to yesterday's bookies. The moral difference remains debatable. By the end of the century, bookmakers were a fixture of British life, despised, indispensable, and often richer than the gamblers they served. They strutted across racecourses in bright waistcoats, pockets bulging, voices hoarse from shouting odds over the thunder of hooves. They were equal parts villain and visionary, and every gambler needed one, until the day came when they couldn't pay him back. In the Georgian world, bookmakers kept the nation's debts organised, the gamblers optimistic, and the police gainfully employed, a miracle of paperwork, panic, and profit, all balanced on one very questionable ledger. In Georgian Britain, power didn't just change hands in Parliament, it changed hands over cards. The men who shaped the laws of an empire by day were just as likely to reshuffle fortunes by night. For the political elite, governing the nation and gambling its wealth were practically the same activity. Both demanded confidence, cunning, and an extraordinary ability to bluff while holding absolutely nothing. The House of Commons might have been the stage of democracy, but the true theatre of politics unfolded in the gaming clubs of St James's and the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. Here, debates continued long after the parliamentary bells had stopped ringing, and policy often shared the table with port gossip and hazard dice. Votes could be won, lost, or at least softened over a game of cards. Britain's laws were drafted on parchment, but its alliances were sealed in cigarette smoke and spilled wine. Few embodied this mixture of politics and play better than Charles James Fox, the lion of the Whigs and possibly the most talented man ever to ruin his own bank account. Fox was brilliant, eloquent, and utterly enslaved to gambling. He could quote Homer in the Commons and then lose £10,000 at Brooks before dawn, a feat of multitasking that would have impressed even his creditors. His nightly habits became so infamous that when he was late to a debate, colleagues would simply ask, "Is he winning or losing?" Fox's debt was legendary. He owed enough money to fund a minor war. Yet his charisma made ruin look romantic. Contemporaries described him as born for the dice box. He viewed gambling the same way he viewed politics, an arena where fortune favoured the bold, and consequences were someone else's problem. One friend remarked that Fox could persuade an audience or a banker with equal ease, the difference being that the banker always regretted it first. He wasn't alone. Parliament in the 18th century was crawling with political gamblers, men who believed risk was a patriotic virtue. The same reckless optimism that drove them to bet on horses also fueled their approach to empire, taxation, and foreign wars. If a member could gamble away an estate at the table and still swagger into the Commons the next day, why not gamble a little more on expanding India or reforming Ireland? Many sessions of Parliament began bleary-eyed after nights at White's or Almack's, where ministers rubbed elbows with noblemen, soldiers and spies. Conversation flowed like claret, and the lines between statecraft and stupidity blurred beyond recognition. Deals were struck, appointments arranged, and reputations destroyed under the guise of friendly play. Even the Prime Minister himself was rarely exempt. Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto Prime Minister, was rumoured to have won and lost fortunes in private games, though he prudently ensured his luck was better in politics than in cards. In the gilded chaos, gambling wasn't seen as a moral failing. It was almost a qualification for leadership. A man who couldn't take risks at the table surely couldn't be trusted with an empire. The same qualities prized in gambling and nerve with calculation, charm and timing blah were precisely what defined the Georgian political ideal. The difference was that in Parliament the chips were colonies and human lives. Yet for all their bravado, the consequences of political gambling could be severe. The debts piled up, not just in ledgers but in influence. Wealthy patrons who rescued politicians from ruin often expected favours in return. A seat, a vote, a contract. Corruption and credit became two sides of the same coin. Parliament wasn't just full of gamblers, it was run by them. One notorious example was the Earl of Sandwich, yes, the man who gave his name to your lunch. He was a statesman, a naval administrator, and an enthusiastic player of hazard. Legend has it that he invented the sandwich so he could eat without leaving the gaming table. Whether true or not, it captures the spirit of the age. Governance and gambling were so intertwined that even dinner adapted. Sandwich lost heavily at cards but somehow managed to hold high office for decades. Proof that in Georgian politics, luck mattered more than competence. Gambling even seeped into foreign diplomacy. Ambassadors entertained each other with wagers, turning political negotiations into games of bluff. In the lavish courts of Europe, British envoys represented not just the crown but the culture of chance. A visiting French minister once remarked, "The English gamble as they breathe quietly and to the death." And Parliament itself wasn't immune to gambling scandals. Reports surfaced of MPs placing bets on the outcomes of their own legislation, essentially wagering on their ability to persuade or bribe their colleagues. The Morning Chronicle gleefully published accounts of the gaming gentlemen of the House, describing members who discussed bills with the same casualness they discussed horse odds. Public outrage followed, of course, and then subsided, as it always did, after the next election and the next bottle of wine. Behind the scenes, the political wives and mistresses of these men often bore the brunt of their husbands' gambling habits. Many estates were mortgaged to cover political campaigns and gaming debts simultaneously. It became a running joke that the road to Westminster was paved not with good intentions but with IOUs. Still, there was a certain charm to this chaos. Georgian politics was a spectacle of charisma and contradiction, a parliament of gamblers ruling a nation of gamblers. The same reckless confidence that sent fleets to war also kept gaming tables alive, and though moralists lamented the decline of virtue, the system somehow survived, largely because everyone was too entertained to reform it. By the turn of the 19th century, the public mood began to shift. Industrial pragmatism replaced aristocratic indulgence, and the idea of ministers rolling dice after midnight began to seem outdated, though not entirely unbelievable. The old gaming clubs remained, but the stakes moved elsewhere, into trade, stocks and speculation. Gambling hadn't died, it had merely evolved into capitalism with better stationery. Britain's leaders might have been terrible at cards, but they excelled at pretending they weren't, which, come to think of it, explains quite a lot about Georgian government. If you ever wander through the rolling hills of England and admire a grand Georgian mansion standing proudly against the horizon, know this. Somewhere, in a smoky room 2 centuries ago, a man probably lost his mind, and his fortune, trying to build it. Beneath the polished marble floors and elegant symmetry of Britain's Georgian estates lay a foundation poured from debt, vanity and very bad gambling decisions. The Georgian era was an age of architectural ambition, when the wealthy competed not only in card rooms but also in construction. A grand house wasn't just a home, it was a public declaration of prosperity, a brag carved in stone. Every nobleman wanted his own miniature Versailles, every merchant his personal palace. But there was a catch. To fund these masterpieces, many relied on their luck at the gaming table. Spoiler: luck, like plasterwork, tends to crack. The 18th century saw an explosion of country house building, fueled by both colonial wealth and aristocratic insecurity. Architects like Robert Adam and John Nash created designs so lavish they made the ancient Romans look thrifty. Columns, domes, and sweeping staircases became the currency of status. Yet behind many of these facades was a far less elegant truth: unpaid bills and desperate wagers. A Georgian gentleman might spend his morning inspecting blueprints and his evening losing the funds that paid for them. The dice rolled faster than the builders worked. Some noblemen financed entire wings of their estates with borrowed money, confident they'd win it back at next week's card party. It rarely ended well. Letters from the time are full of subtle panic. My builder grows impatient, but Providence and my luck at Pharaoh shall surely see it through. Providence, unfortunately, did not take bets. Consider the story of Sir John Bland, who inherited an immense Yorkshire fortune, complete with a grand estate and a title. He lost it all, piece by piece, in a whirlwind of gambling debts. By the end of his short, spectacular downfall, even his family portraits had been sold off. The estate, once a symbol of eternal grandeur, was dismantled to pay creditors. Bland himself fled abroad, only to die in disgrace. His manor became a cautionary tale whispered by neighbours who naturally continued to gamble anyway, and he was hardly alone. Across Britain, ruined estates dotted the landscape like gravestones of bad luck. Some were left unfinished, their skeletal shells standing as monuments to overconfidence. Others were maintained by increasingly desperate heirs, who mortgaged and remortgaged every acre until even the wallpaper seemed nervous. Visitors might compliment the craftsmanship of the ceiling, unaware it was held up by unpaid craftsmen. What made it even more absurd was the aesthetic obsession that drove these men to ruin. Georgian architecture worshipped order, symmetry, and harmony, ideals that gambling utterly destroyed. A gentleman might lecture guests about classical proportion in the afternoon and lose his fortune to loaded dice that same night. The contrast was poetic: perfect geometry on the walls, total chaos in the ledgers. The social pressure to build and to gamble fed each other like twin addictions. Hosting lavish dinners in one's new ballroom was meaningless if one couldn't also host gaming nights afterward. The same rooms built to impress guests became the scenes of their owners' undoing. A grand staircase wasn't just a design feature. It was where creditors waited when the host tried to sneak out the back. And let's not forget the servants, who watched it all unfold like unwilling spectators in a tragicomedy. They polished silver that might soon be pawned and served wine to guests betting away their master's inheritance. Some even placed quiet bets on how long their employer would last before the estate was seized. A safe wager was not long. The collapse of these fortunes had ripple effects far beyond polite society. Villages built around grand estates suffered when their lords went bankrupt. Construction halted mid-project, leaving half-finished columns and unpaid stonemasons. Entire economies in rural England depended on the spending habits of men whose business plans amounted to, "I'll win it back next week." When they didn't, the results were catastrophic. By the late 18th century, the countryside had become a patchwork of extravagance and decay. Some estates glittered with new wealth, their owners flush from trade or lucky investments. Others stood storm, windows boarded, gardens overgrown, a haunting reminder of fortunes lost to folly. Travellers marvelled at these empty shells, calling them architectural ghosts, the remains of dreams too big to survive reality. Ironically, the architectural legacy of Georgian gambling is stunning. Many of these debt-fueled homes still stand today, now National Trust properties or filming locations for costume dramas. Their builders may have been financial disasters, but their taste was impeccable. Modern visitors stroll through ballrooms once echoing with laughter, curses, and the faint clatter of dice. Few realise that the beauty surrounds them was paid for in despair. Contemporaries, of course, recognise the irony. Writers and satirists gleefully mocked the connection between vice and vanity. Caricaturists like James Gilray drew portly lords standing proudly before mansions labelled Mortgage Hall, holding dice instead of blueprints. Moralists thundered that these estates were monuments to the madness of men who mistake luck for providence. But the truth was more tragic and more human. The Georgian elite built because they believed permanence could be bought. They gambled because they feared their fortune, like their fashion, would go out of style. In the end, the Georgian countryside became a museum of ambition, filled with estates that looked eternal but were, in reality, fragile monuments to fleeting luck. The plaster cracked, the debts outlived their makers, and the ivy crept in like poetic justice. The moral of Georgian architecture: always build on solid ground, and never with money you won last night at cards. For every gentleman who believed in luck, there was another who preferred certainty. In Georgian Britain, certainty often came with a trick deck, a pair of tampered dice, and a very steady hand. As gambling fever consumed the nation, it created not only losers and winners, but a third category entirely: professional cheats, the connoisseurs of deception who turned trickery into an art form and made dishonesty one of the most lucrative professions of the 18th century. The Georgian world was obsessed with chance, but chance could be manipulated by those who understood human weakness and who could keep a straight face while doing it. The professional cheat didn't gamble with the cards. He gambled against the people holding them, and in a culture that idolized elegance, wit, and performance, cheating fit right in. After all, what was a loaded die if not a well-timed theatrical flourish? Cheating wasn't just petty crime, it was a craft. These were not amateurs fumbling with aces up their sleeves. They were mathematicians, illusionists, and psychologists rolled into one. They studied the shuffle like a priest studies scripture, practiced palming cards for hours. Ansend could mark a deck so subtly that even an expert wouldn't notice until his wallet was gone. Their tools were works of art: weighted dice, mirrored snuff boxes, invisible inks, and decks whose corners told stories. London naturally became their capital. Beneath the chandeliers of Mayfair and the smoky corners of Covent Garden, cheats worked both ends of society. At the top, they infiltrated gentlemen's clubs, charming noblemen with perfect manners and terrible intentions. At the bottom, they haunted taverns and coffee houses, fleecing sailors, apprentices, and anyone foolish enough to think luck was democratic. The card sharp was the most elegant of the species. Dressed impeccably, armed with silver-tipped snuff boxes and disarming smiles, he could make even suspicion look rude. Many were travelling professionals who moved from city to city, leaving behind a trail of empty purses and bruised egos. Their tricks were endless. Bottom dealing, where the cheat slipped a prearranged card from the deck's underside. Second dealing, where the top card was revealed, but the second was played, or the subtle false shuffle, which appeared random but kept certain sequences perfectly intact. Watching one of these men work was like watching sleight of hand performed by the devil in a wig. Then there were the dice riggers, specialists in turning simple cubes into instruments of destiny. Weighted dice and shaved corners, even as dice with tiny bits of mercury inside, so they'd always land favourably. Each invention proved that Georgian ingenuity extended far beyond architecture and philosophy. These artisans of deceit practiced endlessly, flicking dice until the laws of probability themselves began to sweat. But even the best tricksters needed partners. Enter the Confederates, accomplices posing as innocent bystanders who just happened to join the game. Their role was to amplify trust, stir excitement, and occasionally act as fall guys when things went wrong. Together, they worked the crowd like a theatrical troupe. The sharp as the star, the Confederate as the chorus, and the mark as the unwitting audience. The stakes were enormous. In elite circles where fortunes were exchanged in single hands, a skilled cheat could earn the equivalent of a modern banker's salary in one night. Some cheats became so successful they retired to the countryside under assumed names, buying estates built on fraud, proof that in Britain, even crime aspired to respectability. Naturally, where there were cheats, there were moral crusaders. Newspapers ran outraged editorials about infamous sharpers deceiving honest men of means. Pamphlets circulated with titles like The Gambler's Mirror or The Art of Detection. These manuals claimed to teach readers how to spot deceit, but mostly served to make cheats even more creative. Like a deadly arms race, each new trick inspired a new counter-trick, and vice versa. Some gaming clubs even employed professional inspectors, men hired specifically to detect cheating. Ironically, these inspectors were often former cheats themselves, because who better to spot a con than someone who'd mastered it? It was a beautiful cycle of corruption. Thieves catching thieves, all paid by people who didn't trust anyone. Of course, not every cheat was subtle. There were the bluffing brutes, gamblers who relied less on sleight of hand and more on intimidation. A dagger at one's belt could do wonders for the integrity of a card game. Duels and fistfights were not uncommon when deception was discovered, though most cheats preferred flight to honour. London's alleys were filled with men vanishing into the fog before dawn, their pockets full and their reputations in tatters. The fascination with cheating bled into culture. Theatre, literature and art all took inspiration from the card table underworld. Plays like The Gaming Table and novels such as Henry Fielding's Jonathan Wild portrayed rogues who outwitted society through cunning rather than class. Painters like Caravaggio and later Georgian artists loved depicting moments of revelation. When the cheat is caught, cards spilling, faces aghast. Audiences loved these stories not because they condemned cheating, but because they secretly admired it. After all, wasn't everyone trying to cheat fate a little? Even the language of gambling absorbed the cheat's influence. Words like sharper, stacked deck and double dealer became part of everyday speech. By the late 18th century, being called a bit of a sharper could be either an insult or a compliment depending on how well one dressed. The Georgian public's attitude was contradictory. They despised cheaters, but they also envied them. By century's end, the professional cheat had become an archetype of the age. Cunning, witty, morally ambiguous, and undeniably stylish. He was the mirror image of Georgian society itself, obsessed with appearances, driven by greed, and sustained by performance. The honest gambler prayed for luck. The cheat manufactured it. In Georgian Britain, cheating wasn't a scandal, it was entrepreneurship with flair. The only real sin was getting caught, and even then, only if your waistcoat was unfashionable. By the mid-18th century, Britain's lawmakers had finally looked up from their card tables long enough to notice that the entire nation was, quite literally, betting itself into oblivion. Fortunes were vanishing, estates collapsing, and public morals sliding into chaos. And Parliament, in a moment of spectacular irony, decided to do something about it. The same men who had been losing thousands at Brooks's and White's now took it upon themselves to save the nation from gambling. It was a little like appointing arsonists to run the fire brigade. The result was a steady parade of gambling acts, each grandly announced, loudly debated, and immediately ignored. From the early 1700s onward, Parliament seemed determined to outlaw vice by sheer repetition. Every decade brought a new piece of legislation promising to finally tame the beast, and every decade the beast merely yawned, shuffled its deck, and placed a new wager on how long the next law would last. The first major attempt came with the Gaming Act of 1710, which declared all large wagers null and void. In theory, no one could legally sue to recover gambling debts over £100. In practice, gentlemen simply learned to not sue. They handled their debts the old-fashioned way, by blackmail, public shaming, or duelling at dawn. The law didn't stop gambling, it merely replaced lawyers with pistols. Later came the 1728 and 1738 amendments, which tried to close loopholes but only succeeded in teaching the British upper class how to dig better ones. Clever aristocrats began disguising their wagers as friendly loans or investments, while others shifted to underground gaming clubs so private that even the servants needed references. The crown jewel of legislative optimism arrived with the Gaming Act of 1774, which thundered against excessive and ruinous play. It forbade professional gambling houses, outlawed public lotteries, and gave magistrates authority to fine offenders. The moralists cheered. The gamblers shrugged. Within weeks, gaming houses were back in business under creative new titles: private societies for social amusement, mutual benefit associations, and, my personal favourite, scientific card evenings. Nothing in Britain is more powerful than the human capacity to rename sin as a hobby. Even the press joined the farce, reporting each new crackdown with the same weary amusement. Pamphleteers wrote satirical guides explaining how to avoid detection. Simply play in a private house, one quipped, and ensure the magistrate is among your guests. Others mocked the hypocrisy of enforcement. Many of the judges charged with punishing gamblers were known to spend their evenings losing politely at whist. One magistrate, according to legend, raided a gaming house on Monday, only to be discovered there himself on Wednesday. His defence was poetic. "I wish to observe their methods closely." One might call it research, others called it relapse. The real problem was that gambling wasn't confined to dark corners. It was woven into every stratum of Georgian life. Parliament could outlaw cards and dice, but it couldn't outlaw human boredom. When men weren't betting on cards, they were betting on horse races, political elections, or the length of sermons. Even the church wasn't immune. In one case, a vicar was charged with organising a raffle to repair his church roof. He argued that it wasn't gambling, it was divine fundraising. The court disagreed, but the roof was repaired, so who really won? The police, bless them, tried to keep up. Constables raided gaming houses, smashed tables and confiscated decks, only for the same establishments to reopen under new management by the weekend. Some officers conveniently accepted tips not to notice. Others simply joined the games. Policing gambling in Georgian London was like trying to drain the Thames with a teacup. Meanwhile, the lottery craze exploded. The government, in a dazzling display of hypocrisy, realised it could make more money from gambling than it could by banning it. So it launched the state lottery, an officially sanctioned gamble that operated from 1694 well into the 19th century. The same parliament that condemned private wagers now advertised national ones. Clergymen preached against cards on Sunday and bought lottery tickets on Monday. The message was clear: gambling was immoral, unless the government got a cut. Satirists had a field day. Caricatures by artists like James Gilray depicted politicians passing gambling laws with one hand while throwing dice with the other. Newspapers printed poems mocking the futility of reform. They ban the cards and close the den, yet play again by 10:30. Despite the endless legislation, public appetite only grew. The very act of prohibition made gambling more glamorous. Secret clubs multiplied, attracting not only the aristocracy, but also ambitious merchants and artists who wanted to mingle with the fashionable damned. To be caught gambling was almost a badge of sophistication, proof that one's life was exciting enough to be illegal. Even women, officially forbidden from participating, found ways to skirt the law. Lady gamblers rebranded their soirees as charity entertainments, donating a sliver of the proceeds to orphanages to lend moral cover. The police didn't know whether to arrest them or applaud. By the closing decades of the century, the gambling acts had piled up like uncollected debts, dozens of statutes, amendments and proclamations, none of which made the slightest dent in the nation's obsession. Moral reformers despaired. One pamphlet in 1798 declared, "Vice has outlived law, and the dice still rule Britannia." It was hard to argue. The truth was that Britain didn't want to stop gambling. It just wanted to look respectable while doing it. The upper class continued to play in secret, the middle class in coffee houses, and the working class in taverns. Each blamed the other for society's corruption. In that sense, the Gambling Act succeeded brilliantly. They gave everyone someone else to blame. By the dawn of the 19th century, the government quietly stopped pretending. Instead of ending the habit, it began taxing it. The moral crusade had evolved into fiscal policy. The law, it seemed, had finally learned what gamblers knew all along. If you can't beat the game, you might as well take a cut of the winnings. Parliament spent a century outlawing gambling and ended up inventing the national lottery. In Georgian Britain, even failure had a profit margin. When the music stopped and the dice cooled, Georgian gamblers discovered something more terrifying than bad luck. The morning after, the chandeliers were dark, the cards were scattered, and the creditors were waiting. Across 18th century Britain, gambling didn't just empty pockets, it stripped homes bare. And when fortunes fell, there was only one destination left for the newly destitute aristocrat, the bankrupt merchant, or the overconfident socialite, the pawn shop. The pawn shop was the great equalizer of Georgian society. It didn't care whether you were a duke or a debtor. It cared only whether you had something shiny. On any given morning, its door might swing open to reveal a nobleman in last night's rumpled finery, clutching his wife's pearls and an expression that said, "Please don't tell anyone you saw me here." In the elegant language of ruin, liquidating assets often meant selling family heirlooms before breakfast. London alone was home to hundreds of pawn shops, from the discreet boutiques of Bond Street to the more pungent establishments of Holborn and Fleet Market. They were the bankers of despair, offering instant cash to those who had run out of respectable options. Their windows gleamed with watches, rings, snuff boxes, candlesticks, and occasionally the family silver, items traded in the desperate hope that tomorrow's luck would be better. Spoiler, it rarely was. For the gambler, pawning became part of the cycle. A bad night at the tables meant a visit to the pawnbroker at dawn, a temporary reprieve before the next round of ruin. Many even developed friendly relationships with their local brokers, an ironic twist considering pawnbrokers were widely despised by society at large. Satirical prints depicted them as vultures in wigs, preying on misfortune. Yet for those addicted to risk, the pawnbroker wasn't an enemy. He was an enabler with a ledger. The typical transaction was simple but humiliating. The gambler would enter with an item, say a gold watch or a diamond brooch, and the pawnbroker, with the solemn precision of a man measuring someone's dignity, would appraise it. Negotiation followed, a polite duel of desperation and calculation. "Fine piece, sir," the broker might say, "but quite out of fashion. I can offer 30 guineas. The gambler, once a lord of leisure, would swallow his pride and accept, knowing full well he'd be back to retrieve it, if fortune ever smiled again. Of course, most never did reclaim their treasures. The pawned goods piled up like the museum of a fallen empire, paintings, silver teapots, and embroidered waistcoats all lingering in limbo. A lady's fan that once fluttered at a royal ball might now hang behind glass, waiting for a buyer who didn't know it came with a side order of heartbreak. Some gamblers pawned items so personal it bordered on tragicomedy. There are recorded cases of aristocrats pawning portraits of themselves, promising to buy them back after their next win. Others pawned wigs, coats, or even bed curtains. A particularly unlucky gentleman in 1789 pawned his entire library, including a book on probability. Historians never confirmed if he saw the irony. And while the aristocracy conducted its pawning with quiet shame, the working class did it openly and frequently. Pawning was part of the weekly rhythm for labourers and servants, who used it as a crude form of credit between paydays. For them, it wasn't gambling losses, but survival that drove the trade. Monday, pawn your coat. Saturday, redeem it. Sunday, wear it to church and pretend life was stable. But for the gambler, the stakes were always grander, and the consequences more theatrical. The pawn shop's interiors were grimly fascinating. Walls lined with shelves of forgotten luxury, the air thick with dust and desperation. Behind the counter sat the pawnbroker, half banker, half undertaker, recording each transaction with cold efficiency. He was the final stop in the gambler's downward spiral after the card tables, after the creditors, after the false promises to turn it all around. By the time you reached the pawnbroker, hope was already collateral. Pamphleteers and satirists seized on the image of the fallen gambler at the pawnbroker's desk. James Gilray's etchings showed well-dressed rakes pawning family heirlooms, while their servants looked on in horror. Writers describe pawn shops as the silent confessionals of sin, where the glittering remnants of high life were catalogued, priced, and sold to strangers. It was poetic justice, perhaps. The same hand that once rolled dice now signing away an ancestral ring for ale money. Yet the trade was thriving and surprisingly modern. Many pawn shops were run by women, often widows who managed them as respectable businesses. Their clients, particularly female gamblers, found it easier to negotiate discreetly with another woman. These Madam Pawnbrokers, as they were called, offered both confidentiality and cash, ensuring that ruin could remain a private affair. The most famous of them, Mrs. Hayes of Oxford Street, reportedly dealt with half the ton. She kept meticulous records, accepted jewels, lace and furniture, and was known for her impeccable discretion. Her clients included titled ladies who arrived veiled, pawning diamond tiaras one week and repurchasing them the next. For these women, the pawn shop was not shameful. It was part of managing the delicate economy of appearances. Meanwhile, the secondary market for pawned goods flourished. Auction houses and dealers bought up forfeited items and resold them to the newly rich, who were always eager to decorate their drawing rooms with someone else's history. Thus the great wheel of Georgian irony turned. One man's ruin became another man's refinement. By the late 18th century, pawn shops were so ubiquitous that they became part of London's moral landscape, symbols of both human weakness and resilience. They allowed the illusion of control to persist, offering the gambler a chance to say, "I'm not broke, I'm just temporarily unliquid." It was, in a way, the most British of delusions. The Georgian pawnbroker didn't just buy jewellery. He bought stories, secrets and shattered egos, and all at a fair discount. After all, nothing holds its value worse than last night's luck. In the grand houses of Georgian England, while lords and ladies gambled away empires above stairs, the servants below stairs had the best seats in the house. They poured the wine, refilled the candles, carried the gossip, and, most importantly, kept very, very quiet. To be a servant in a gambling household was to live inside a live-action tragedy, complete with drama, debts, and the occasional broken candelabra hurled in despair. But the servants weren't merely spectators. Sometimes they were participants. Servants were the silent witnesses of Georgian vice, the uncredited narrators of their employer's ruin. They saw the drunken triumphs, the whispered IOUs, the desperate posturing that preceded collapse. When a nobleman swore he'd never gamble again, the butler was the first to smirk, because he'd already scheduled extra brandy for the next night. The Georgian upper classes might have believed in the sanctity of privacy, but the truth was that nothing stayed secret below stairs. Information trickled down faster than spilled port. A footman collecting empty glasses might overhear who had lost a fortune at hazard. A lady's maid folding gowns might notice jewellery disappearing from the dressing table. By breakfast, the kitchen knew what the drawing room denied. This underground grapevine wasn't malicious. It was survival. Servants needed to know when wages might temporarily pause, when creditors might arrive at the door, or when their employer might suddenly flee to the continent. Betting on the timing of these disasters wasn't uncommon. A week, maybe two, the cook might wager, kneading dough while predicting bankruptcy. It was gallows humour in the most literal sense. When the master fell, the household followed. For the servants of gambling-addicted households, work became equal parts employment and endurance. Some employers lost so heavily that servants went unpaid for months, surviving on scraps and stolen wine. In one account from 1782, a valet recorded pawning his master's waistcoat to buy food, only for the master to scold him for losing the better pawn ticket price. The irony was delicious. Both employer and servant were trapped in the same cycle of desperation, though one had better waistcoats. Others, however, saw opportunity in their master's weakness. The more observant servants, especially valets and butlers, learned to profit from what they knew. A discreet warning to a moneylender, a whispered rumour to the press, or the strategic borrowing of gaming debts could be worth more than a year's wages. In a society obsessed with appearances, information was the most valuable currency, and servants were the best bankers. Even the supposedly loyal staff had limits. When fortunes collapsed, they adapted swiftly. Some sold gossip to tabloids and pamphleteers, feeding the public's insatiable appetite for scandal. A servant's true account of the night at Devonshire House might fetch a handsome price, even if half of it was embellished. Readers didn't mind. In the Georgian imagination, servants were both villains and truth-tellers, low-born witnesses to the hypocrisy of their betters. But not all servants were content to merely observe. Some caught the gambling bug themselves. After all, when you spend your night surrounded by cards, dice, and drunken nobles making wagers about everything from horse races to weather, temptation is inevitable. Footmen bet on dogfights, maids bet on whose master would go bankrupt first, and stable boys ran secret wagers on the outcomes of carriage accidents. One coachman reportedly made more money betting on his employer's horse races than his employer did owning the horses. In the great houses, servants even held their own games of chance after the household retired, of course. The scullery might become a miniature casino with candle stubs for light and stolen coins for stakes. The cook's assistant shuffled cards greasy from flour, and the butler dealt with the calm of a man who'd watched aristocrats ruin themselves over finer tables. Winners walked away with bragging rights and a few extra shillings. Losers promised to do better next night. Some things, it seems, never changed. Only the upholstery. The power dynamics of gambling also played strange tricks on the servant-master relationship. A valet who'd seen his lord blubber over lost wages might quietly hold a kind of moral superiority. He knew his employer's debts, his mistresses, and how many tears he shed after losing a month's income to a smiling duchess. In public, the master commanded authority. In private, the servant knew the truth. It was a delicate balance of pity and contempt, the unspoken understanding that one man's dignity often rested on another man's discretion. And sometimes discretion failed spectacularly. One famous scandal involved Lord Barrymore, a reckless gambler known as Hellgate Barrymore. After losing an enormous sum at hazard, he reportedly ordered his butler to fetch his pistol so he could end it all. The butler, weary from years of melodrama, calmly unloaded the weapon and returned it with a bow. Barrymore pulled the trigger, the gun clicked uselessly, and he muttered, "I suppose even my death won't come off." The butler allegedly replied, "Not at those odds, my lord." It was the perfect Georgian epitaph, dignity undone by irony. Servants also played a crucial role in the machinery of credit that fueled their masters' gambling habits. When debts mounted, it was often the footman sent to deliver IOUs or collect cash from pawnbrokers. Maids smuggled jewellery to be sold quietly. Butlers negotiated with creditors, balancing charm and threats. Servants became intermediaries in the delicate dance of financial ruin, patching the leaks in a sinking ship they could never steer. Their observations have since become historians' gold mines. Diaries, letters, and memoirs written by servants, often decades later, reveal details their masters never intended for posterity. They paint a vivid picture of the emotional economy of the household: fear, fascination, resentment, and a surprising dose of dark humour. A butler once wrote, "The master lost everything but kept his pride. We lost our wages but kept the silver." Despite their cynicism, there was also loyalty, strange, stubborn, and deeply human. Many servants stayed through their employer's ruin, not out of devotion, but out of habit, inertia, or the faint hope that things might improve. They were witnesses to collapse and custodians of memory, preserving the dignity their masters could no longer afford. By the end of the century, when the great gambling estates began to crumble, servants were often the last ones standing, literally. They closed the shutters, sold the furniture, and watched as the world that had employed them vanished into history. They'd seen it all. Fortune, folly, and farce. And by the time the dust settled, the servants knew the true odds of Georgian life. The house always wins, and the housekeeper usually knows why. For many Georgians, the road from gambling table to prison cell was a short and well-trodden one. It began with a laugh, a toast, and a dice roll, and ended with the clang of iron and the sweet aroma of despair. In the 18th century, debt wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a crime, punishable by incarceration. And in a society obsessed with appearances, nothing stripped away a gentleman's dignity faster than being locked up with his creditors waiting at the gate. If Georgian gambling was a national pastime, debtor's prison was its natural sequel. These were not the dark dungeons of medieval myth, but something arguably worse. Institutions that pretended to be civilized while functioning as warehouses for human ruin. London alone boasted several such establishments: the Fleet Prison, Marshalsea, and King's Bench, each with its own hierarchy of misery. Some were large enough to form their own grim little neighbourhoods, filled with debtors, their families, and the occasional opportunistic tavern keeper who saw profit in despair. The process of ending up there was brutally simple. If you couldn't pay your debts, whether to a banker, a friend, or a furious pharaoh hostess, your creditor could have you arrested. There was no bankruptcy protection, no restructuring plan, no polite letter from your accountant. The law considered debt a moral failure, a personal disgrace. It didn't matter if you'd been cheated, unlucky, or simply foolish, and justice arrived in the form of a warrant. The debtor would be seized, sometimes directly from his home or even the gaming table, and escorted to a place where gambling was no longer optional. Inside the Fleet Prison, the most infamous of the lot, chaos reigned under a veneer of routine. Debtors were technically gentlemen prisoners, allowed to bring in their own food, servants, and furniture, if they could afford it. The wealthier inmates rented private rooms, complete with writing desks and curtains, and continued living with absurd civility. They dined on roasted fowl, played cards, because irony is eternal, and entertained visitors. Some even held mock balls to pass the time, attended by their fellow debtors in whatever finery hadn't yet been pawned. It was Georgian society in miniature, with slightly worse ventilation. The poor, however, endured a different kind of imprisonment. Cramped dormitories held dozens of men who had long since abandoned hope. They slept on straw, ate watery broth, and watched rats scurry across the floorboards. Disease spread easily, morale decayed faster than the bread, and the noise of arguments, coughing, and creditors shouting through the gates created a symphony of humiliation. Perhaps most grotesque was that debtors were required to pay for their own imprisonment. The prison's turnkeys, guards, charged fees for everything: entrance, bedding, candles, even air circulation. If you couldn't pay, you were thrown into the common side, a polite term for hell on earth. There, inmates begged through the bars for pennies from passers-by. "Please, for the price of freedom," was a common cry along the streets outside the Fleet. It was a system designed to profit from failure, capitalism's cruel rehearsal. And yet, within this misery existed a bizarre social mingling. Dukes, poets, merchants, and conmen rubbed shoulders, or rather bunks. Class distinctions blurred inside the walls. The man who had once hosted glittering dinners now shared a cell with his former coachman. The gambler who once lectured on the elegance of risk now bartered for bread. For a society obsessed with hierarchy, it was the ultimate humiliation. Georgian newspapers described the prisons as melancholy academies of equality. Some debtors used their incarceration as an excuse to reinvent themselves. The witty or the literate turned their experiences into memoirs, pamphlets, or plays. The poet Richard Savage famously lived in the Fleet for months, writing verses about freedom of the soul while owing several pounds to his tailor. Others turned to humour as self-defence. "If fortune is blind," one prisoner wrote, "then she certainly stumbled into the Fleet." For the compulsive gambler, debtor's prison was both punishment and continuation. Deprived of formal gaming tables, inmates improvised, dice carved from bone, cards drawn on scraps of paper, and bets placed on trivialities like who will get bread first or how long the next sermon will last. Even ruin couldn't kill the instinct for risk. Some men literally gambled with their rations. One visitor noted in horror that the inmates' dice rolled not for money, but for meat. Women also filled the debtors' prisons, though their stories were often quieter and more tragic. Many were wives or widows held responsible for their husbands' debts. Some were gamblers themselves, especially those who had hosted salons that spiraled into disaster. Without property rights or independent income, they fared far worse than their male counterparts. A few managed to maintain dignity. One duchess reportedly ordered her maid to dust the cell as if it were Devonshire House, but for most the experience was devastating. The public fascination with debtors' prisons was morbid and enduring. Tourists could pay small fees to visit and observe the inmates, a kind of proto-reality show for the morally smug. "There but for the grace of God," whispered the visitors before returning home to their card tables. Writers and artists turned the prisons into symbols of moral decay, but also hypocrisy. After all, half the men passing laws against gambling had brothers behind bars for it. By the end of the century, criticism began to mount. Reformers argued that imprisoning debtors made no sense. You can't earn money when you're locked up. The absurdity was clear even to those in power. The Debtors' Relief Act of 1793 freed thousands who owed small sums, but for the grand gamblers of society, nothing changed. Those who had ruined themselves on vast wagers still languished behind bars, too proud to beg, too stubborn to stop believing their luck would turn. The irony of Georgian justice was complete. The same system that worshipped wealth punished those who lost it. To owe was to sin, and to sin was to be confined, all while the real gamblers in government and finance continued their own high-stakes games outaimed. The prisons became grim reminders that in Georgian Britain, debt was not just economic, it was existential. Inside debtors' prison, class distinctions vanished, hope was collateral, and luck finally called in its debts. For once, the aristocracy truly mingled with the common man, mostly because they were sharing the same straw mattress. When it came to gambling in Georgian Britain, no one was too noble, too pious, or too powerful to resist the siren call of the cards. The fever that gripped the coffee houses, the clubs and the drawing rooms did not stop at the palace gates. It marched right into the royal household, sat down beside the crown jewels, and shuffled the deck. For in the 18th century, even the monarchy itself couldn't resist a wager. The British royal family, ever eager to set the tone for national behaviour, for better or worse, made gambling not merely fashionable, it made it majestic. Kings and princes bet with the same reckless abandon as their subjects, except that their spare change could finance a small army. The divine right of kings, it seemed, included the divine right to overdraw. The Georgian dynasty was particularly cursed, or blessed, depending on your appetite for irony, with a fondness for cards. The Hanoverians, starting with George III and continuing through his descendants, turned gaming into a royal pastime as natural as fox hunting or scandal. At court, games of hazard, whist and faro were as common as tea and nearly as essential to diplomacy. To be invited to a royal gaming table was an honour. To leave it solvent was a miracle. King George II was the first of the family to make gambling a respectable fixture of royal evenings. His consort, Queen Caroline, was said to tolerate it with the same resigned patience she afforded his mistresses. Courtiers recalled long evenings at St James's Palace, where ministers and noblewomen surrounded at the table like worshippers at a glittering altar, their expressions equal parts reverence and desperation. Gold coins clinked, powdered wigs trembled, and political alliances were made or broken between rounds. But it was under George III and his notoriously extravagant sons that gambling reached imperial levels of absurdity. George III himself was famously moral, even dull, preferring astronomy and agriculture to dice. Unfortunately, his offspring viewed restraint as a challenge. The royal children were living proof that moral lectures do not always survive contact with inheritance. The worst offender, by a landslide, was George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, the man practically turned dissipation into performance art. Known for his charm, gluttony, and catastrophic finances, the prince lived his entire life as a high-stakes bet against common sense. When not commissioning palaces or seducing actresses, he could be found at gaming tables in Carlton House or Brooks's Club, surrounded by flatterers, champagne and debts. George's gambling was legendary not for its skill but for its enthusiasm. He wagered on cards, horses, elections, and occasionally on whether his waistline would survive the season. He lost astronomical sums at faro, the aristocratic favourite, often borrowing from anyone foolish enough to lend. His tab at Brooks alone reached heights that made even hardened gamblers blanch. Yet he treated ruin as a badge of sophistication. After all, what was the use of being heir to the throne if you couldn't ruin your reputation in style? His circle of friends, collectively nicknamed the Princes of Play, included other blue-blooded degenerates such as the Duke of York and the Duke of Cumberland. They made gambling not just entertainment but identity. Court gossip delighted in stories of nights that began with whist and ended with duels, tears, or both. Their private lives were a roulette wheel spinning out scandal, and their public lives weren't much better. The Duke of York, Commander-in-Chief of the army, was especially fond of high-stakes wagers. His name became so synonymous with debt that his creditors began referring to unpaid bills as York notes. One pamphleteer joked, "The Duke has introduced a new currency, unpayable but ever in circulation." And yet, gambling was not limited to the men. The royal women played too, though society judged them with predictable double standards. Queen Charlotte, George III's long-suffering wife, was fond of card games, but approached them with a prudence none of her sons inherited. Princesses Augusta and Elizabeth occasionally joined court games, though only for small sums, out of both propriety and a keen understanding of the family's fiscal disaster. In royal circles, gambling wasn't just recreation, it was politics disguised as pleasure. Invitations to the Queen's gaming tables were coveted because proximity to royal favour often depended on one's ability to lose gracefully. Ministers, ambassadors, and hopeful courtiers all queued to play, knowing a flattering remark over a hand of cards could secure more than gold, it could win influence. To decline the invitation was social suicide, to win too often was political suicide. The problem was that the stakes, both financial and moral, were enormous. The public, already suspicious of royal extravagance, viewed the prince's gambling habits with a mix of fascination and outrage. Pamphlets and caricatures painted them as spoiled children squandering the empire's wealth on dice and ducats. James Gilray's etchings depicted the Prince of Wales surrounded by empty wine bottles and mountains of playing cards, the caption reading, "Royal game of chance, subtle it not." Even Parliament grew nervous. In 1787, when the prince's debts reached scandalous proportions, the government reluctantly stepped in with a bailout, disguised as an arrangement for His Royal Highness's financial relief. The public reaction was predictable fury. While ordinary debtors rotted in prison, the heir to the throne had his IOUs politely absorbed by the state. It was perhaps the earliest recorded instance of the British taxpayer footing the bill for royal bad habits. Still, however, no law or outrage could stop the royals from indulging their passion for risk. It was too deeply ingrained, a reflection of their worldview. Empire itself was, in many ways, a national gamble, a wager on trade, conquest, and chance. The monarchs and princes who presided over this system simply mirrored the culture that adored them. They were gamblers in palaces, playing with higher stakes and finer cards, but the same delusions as everyone else. As the 19th century dawned, and public morality stiffened under Victorian scrutiny, the monarchy began to tidy up its image. The worst of the royal gamblers were dead or dethroned, and the younger generation learned grudgingly that scandal no longer sparkled, but the legacy lingered. The royal fondness for the card table became part of the Georgian mythos, glittering, reckless, and faintly ridiculous. The Georgian kings proved that even divine right couldn't beat bad odds. When the chips were down, Britain's monarchs bet big, lost bigger, and somehow still managed to call it tradition. As the dice rolled and fortunes collapsed across Georgian Britain, another sound rose above the clatter of cards, the righteous thunder of the pulpit. Gambling, declared the nation's clergy, was the devil's arithmetic, a pastime of greed, vanity and damnation. Pamphlets, sermons and moral tracts warned that the gambler's soul was on a one-way coach to eternal ruin. The irony, of course, was that half the congregation listening on Sunday would be playing whist by Monday. The moral panic over gambling wasn't entirely misplaced. By the mid-18th century, Britain's obsession had reached absurd proportions. Whole fortunes were vanishing faster than sermons could condemn them, and gambling was blamed for everything from suicides to social decay. But what made the outcry so fascinating and so deliciously hypocritical was that it came from a society that couldn't stop gambling even as it begged forgiveness for doing so. Every preacher from London to Leeds seemed to take aim at the vice. Gaming, thundered one particularly fiery clergyman in 1779, is a highway to hell, paved with dice and lubricated with brandy. The imagery was vivid, the outrage sincere, and yet his parishioners left the chapel cheerfully discussing who owed whom from last night's card party. Georgian moralism was an art form, repentance in public, relapse in private. Sermons became spectacles of choral theatre, part spiritual guidance, part social commentary. Congregations sat in polite horror as ministers described the gambler's descent. First the card table, then the debt, then despair, then death, and occasionally debtor's prison in between, as a bonus stop. Some preachers delivered entire series titled The Gaming Devil Unmasked, or Dice and Damnation, A Warning to the Faithful. These were as popular as any stage play, complete with dramatic pauses and trembling fists. The pamphlet trade boomed alongside. Moral reformers produced leaflets with lurid titles such as The Gambler's Grave, The Ruin of Souls by the Vice of Play, and A Lady's True Account of Her Fall Through Pharaoh. Spoiler: she lost the game, her dowry, and her will to live, in that order. These stories were morality tales for a nation addicted to its own vices, half warning, half entertainment. The more the clergy raged, the more the public seemed to enjoy the scandal. What made the moral crusade especially absurd was that many preachers themselves weren't immune to temptation. Gambling was so ingrained in Georgian life that even the devout occasionally backslid. There are recorded cases of vicars betting on horse races for educational purposes, and one bishop who was caught playing cards during Lent, insisting he was studying the mathematics of temptation. Clergymen were expected to condemn vice, but preferably in a way that didn't interrupt their weekend whist game. The contradiction went deeper than hypocrisy. It was structural. The Church of England was, after all, intertwined with the same aristocracy that hosted gaming parties. Wealthy patrons funded parishes, endowed pews, and occasionally lost entire church renovations at cards. Few ministers dared to preach too harshly against gambling when the man paying his salary was a habitual gambler himself. The result was a kind of moral diplomacy. Denounce the sin, not the sinner, and certainly not the one who owned your rectory. Outside the established church, evangelical preachers took a harder line. Figures like John Wesley and the Methodists saw gambling as proof of moral rot in the upper classes and spiritual neglect among the poor. Wesley called it a disease of the soul, and urged his followers to reject the idle amusements of Satan's economy. The Methodists, with their focus on self-discipline, treated gambling as the gateway drug to sin. Still, even Wesley admitted it was a difficult habit to stamp out, observing bitterly that men will hazard their salvation as readily as they hazard their coin. Meanwhile, moralists and reformers pushed their agenda through the printed word. They distributed tracts in taverns, theatres and markets, warning that the gambler's hand is guided by the devil's whisper. They drew cartoons of skeletons dealing cards and demons offering dice trays. They claimed that the souls of gamblers glowed faintly red in candlelight, a detail both terrifying and oddly flattering. Yet, as much as they thundered, the preachers couldn't kill the thrill. Gambling had embedded itself into the Georgian psyche because it offered something sermons rarely did. Excitement. Religion promised salvation later. Gaming promised adrenaline now. It was instant drama, with divine punishment postponed indefinitely. You could repent after the next hand, or the next one after that. For many, religion and gambling existed in a strange harmony. It wasn't uncommon for players to pray before a wager or cross themselves after a lucky win. One moralist sighed that men call upon God before drawing the devil's cards. Even within pious households, gambling crept in disguised as innocent amusements. Charades, raffles, and guessing games were tolerated as long as no one used the word bet. Georgian morality, like Georgian architecture, was all about the facade. Women, too, were swept up in the moral storm. The female gambler was a favourite villain in reformist literature, a symbol of fallen virtue and vanity. Preachers warned that a lady who plays for money courts ruin in every sense. But the sermons ignored a simple fact. Women gambled because men did, and often because it was their only social outlet in a world that denied them serious pursuits. If the drawing room was their stage, the card table was their rebellion. Still, as the 18th century drew to a close, the moral panic began to blend with genuine reform. The rise of evangelical movements, combined with public disgust over aristocratic excess, gave gambling an increasingly bad reputation. What had once been a fashionable vice became a mark of corruption. By the early 19th century, the moral crusaders had won, not by persuasion, but by exhaustion. The Georgian gambler simply gambled himself out of fashion. And yet, even as laws tightened and sermons multiplied, the urge never vanished. In every age, reformers have underestimated the human love for risk. The Georgians just made it prettier, with powdered wigs, candlelight, and the faint soundtrack of moral outrage in the background. Georgian preachers warned that dice were the devil's tools, and they were right. He just happened to be very good at rolling sixes. While Britain's gamblers rolled dice and Parliament rolled its eyes, another group was sharpening its own weapons, not cards or coins, but pens, brushes, and biting wit. The 18th century's gambling craze didn't just drain purses, it filled sketchbooks. Artists and satirists, scandal's first responders, turned the nation's obsession into their favourite target. They immortalised every ruined, noble, hysterical hostess and hapless debtor in ink and irony. In the age before tabloids, caricature was both newspaper and noose, and no one drew the rope tighter than William Hogarth. Hogarth's London was a city vibrating with contradiction, refinement and vice sharing the same gin-soaked breath. He saw in gambling not just foolishness, but a symptom of national madness, a moral epidemic spreading faster than syphilis. His engravings captured the rot beneath the powdered wigs, the greed, the vanity, and the sheer comic desperation of people who believed luck could be managed by posture and perfume. His 1735 masterpiece, The Rake's Progress, remains one of the most merciless portraits of gambling ever etched. The series follows the downfall of young Tom Rakewell, a fashionable fool who inherits a fortune and promptly annihilates it in pursuit of pleasure. One of the central scenes, the gaming house, is a carnival of chaos, a Georgian casino mid-meltdown. Cards fly, tables overturn, and gentlemen claw at their wigs in despair while a minister prays in vain. Above them, a riot breaks out in the street, suggesting that the gambling fever had infected the city itself. Hogarth didn't simply illustrate vice, he diagnosed it. And yet, his genius lay not in scolding, but in mockery wrapped in empathy. His gamblers were not monsters, they were human, hilarious, and tragically familiar. Viewers could laugh at them while secretly recognising themselves. It was moral instruction disguised as entertainment, a sermon that hung beautifully on the wall. Other artists followed Hogarth's lead, wielding satire as both scalpel and mirror. The later half of the century saw a golden age of caricature, when artists like James Gilray, Thomas Rowlandson, and Isaac Cruikshank made a living out of lampooning London's compulsive players. Gambling offered the perfect subject. It combined vanity, money, and madness, the holy trinity of British humour. Gilray, especially, turned moral ridicule into an Olympic sport. His prints were bold, grotesque, and gloriously unsubtle. In works like The Hazard Table and Political Ravishment, he portrayed gambling as both personal vice and political metaphor. Politicians were shown as gamblers tossing the nation's future onto the table. Nobles leaned over cards while devils whispered odds into their ears. One of his most famous satires, The Royal Game of the Goose, depicted the Prince of Wales and his cronies chasing fortunes around a board, each square labelled with a sin. The message was unmistakable. Britain was ruled by men who mistook the treasury for pocket change. The public adored it. These engravings were the 18th century equivalent of viral memes, sold in print shops, discussed in coffee houses, and reprinted in magazines. London's print sellers displayed them in shop windows, where crowds gathered to laugh, gasp, and occasionally point awkwardly when they recognised someone they knew. Being featured in a Gilray or Rowlandson print meant instant infamy. To be immortalised in caricature was to lose both your fortune and your privacy. Rowlandson's work added a different flavour, bawdier, more chaotic, less moralising, but just as sharp. His gamblers were rotund, red-faced, and perpetually on the brink of collapse. In one print, the gamblers quarrel, dice scatter across the floor while wigs and tempers fly. Another, Pharaoh's Daughters, skewered fashionable female gamblers with devastating accuracy. Elegant ladies seated at the table, eyes gleaming like predators, while ruined men slumped behind them like decorative corpses. His humour wasn't subtle, but it was irresistible. Meanwhile, writers joined the assault. Novelists and playwrights gleefully turned gambling into narrative gold. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa warned of gaming as moral corruption. Henry Fielding's Tom Jones and Jonathan Wild mocked the gambler's delusion of control, and Sheridan's The School for Scandal, 1777, transformed gossip, cards, and hypocrisy into theatrical genius. The stage became another arena for public shaming, where fashionable vices played out before laughing audiences. But satire wasn't only about condemnation, it was also cultural therapy. The caricaturists were documenting a collective obsession, exorcising it through humour. In a sense, they were doing what modern cartoonists still do, turning anxiety into laughter. Hogarth's rake warned the upper class. Gilray's grotesques mocked the powerful. Rowlandson's chaos delighted the masses. Together, they created a visual morality tale that the nation could laugh at even as it refused to learn from it. There was also a distinctly democratic edge to this artistic rebellion. Gambling had once been the privilege of the elite. Their scandal was private, their downfall discreet. Satire shattered that secrecy. For the first time, the public could see the sins of their betters, printed and sold for a few shillings. The caricaturists turned social commentary into popular justice, where the pen, quite literally, became mightier than the purse. Of course, not everyone found it amusing. Many of the subjects of these prints were horrified. Some even tried to buy up every copy to prevent public embarrassment. Others retaliated with lawsuits or bribes. But caricature was unstoppable. As one anonymous pamphleteer put it, "You may silence a sermon, but never an etching." Once your nose was exaggerated and your debts immortalised in ink, your reputation was finished, and sales went up accordingly. By the dawn of the 19th century, Georgian gambling had begun to fade, but the art it inspired remained immortal. The caricaturists had done more than amuse, they had chronicled a national neurosis. Their prints were the visual conscience of an age that laughed at itself instead of repenting. Today, Hogarth's and Gilray's works hang in galleries, studied as masterpieces of social criticism. But at their core, they were Georgian tabloid covers, witty, brutal, and perfectly timed. Through them, we glimpsed the glittering absurdity of an era that turned destruction into a spectator sport. In Georgian Britain, ruin was temporary, but ridicule was forever. Lose a fortune and you might recover, become a Gilray caricature, and you'd live in disgrace, an exquisite cross-hatching for all eternity. In the glittering world of Georgian high society, the clink of coins and the rustle of silk often came from the same place, the gaming table. It was where reputations were made, fortunes were lost, and etiquette politely looked the other way. But if men gambled for sport, women gambled for survival, social, emotional, and occasionally financial. They were expected to be charming, decorative, and just reckless enough to be entertaining. The trouble was, the line between fashionable flirtation and public disgrace was about as steady as a candle flame in a draughty ballroom. The Georgian woman gambler was a paradox wrapped in lace. Society adored her allure but despised her ambition. She could host glittering card nights attended by dukes and duchesses, yet one unlucky streak could reduce her from Queen of the Salon to cautionary tale. For every duchess praised for her elegance at the faro table, there was a pamphlet waiting to eviscerate her morals by morning. Take, for example, the Duchess of Devonshire, the era's most dazzling hostess and perhaps its most famous gambler. Her soirees were legendary as candlelit spectacles of wit, gossip, and glittering stakes. The Duchess had everything: beauty, power, and a gambling problem big enough to require diplomatic immunity. Guests came to watch her play as much as to play themselves. She made gambling look glamorous, her debts sound poetic, and her ruin seemed like an act of patriotism. When her fortune began to unravel, society didn't recoil. It leaned closer, fascinated by the spectacle. She wasn't alone. London's faro ladies, a term coined with equal parts admiration and contempt, turned card-playing into high fashion. Lady Archer, Lady Buckinghamshire, and Lady Sarah Lennox were among the elite who transformed drawing rooms into miniature casinos. Their tables gleamed with silver candlesticks, their decks were perfumed, and their laughter could make a bishop forget his sermon. But beneath the sparkle was a dangerous truth. Women's gambling was tolerated only until it caused scandal. A gentleman's ruin might provoke sympathy. A lady's ruin provoked moral outrage. When men lost fortunes, they were pitied as victims of bad luck. When women did, they were condemned as proof of society's decay. Newspapers and caricaturists gleefully attacked the faro ladies as predators in petticoats, sirens luring noblemen to ruin with a fan in one hand and a marked card in the other. James Gilray's 1796 caricature, The Faro Bank, immortalised them as grotesque figures surrounded by chaos. One woman rakes in money while others leer, cheat, and drink. It wasn't subtle, but subtlety was never profitable. The public's fascination with female gamblers was a peculiar mix of envy and disgust. Men admired their nerve, but feared their power. A woman who dealt cards was, in a sense, dealing control. And that was scandalous enough. Gambling salons gave women a rare arena in which they could command attention and influence. They could outwit men, manage money, however briefly, and dictate the terms of play. But this small rebellion came with heavy risks. When the debts came due, society turned vicious. Creditors who had once bowed at their doors now demanded repayment. Jewellery vanished into pawn shops, servants were dismissed, and letters pleading for loans circulated among friends. For women, debt was not merely financial, it was social dynamite. A single unpaid bill could explode into ruin. And yet the allure persisted. Gambling offered something that Georgian society otherwise denied women: agency. The card table was one of the few places where wit, intelligence, and nerve could triumph over birth or beauty. In an age when most women's fortunes were tied to marriage, the gaming salon offered an intoxicating illusion of independence. At faro, one diarist wrote, "A lady may command her own fate, though only for the hour." Not all female gamblers were noble. The craze reached the middling and even working classes, where gaming offered both escape and disaster. Tavern raffles, lotteries, and dice games drew women of all walks of life, their small wagers often representing a week's wages. Shopkeepers' wives pawned trinkets to join neighbourhood card circles. Servant girls bet on cockfights. Even nuns in certain European convents reportedly played cards for recreation. The difference was that aristocratic women lost thousands under chandeliers, while the poor lost pennies under candle smoke. The shame, however, was universal. Moralists had a field day. Pamphlets like The Female Gamester, 1752, and A Warning to the Fairer Ladies described women gamblers as unnatural creatures, vain, deceitful, and destined for ruin. A man who plays, one track warned, is a fool, but a woman who plays is a monster. These condemnations were less about morality and more about control. A woman who gambled was stepping outside her assigned role, and society, ever nervous about disorder, slapped her back into place with sermons and satire. Still, for all the outrage, there was an undeniable thrill in their defiance. The female gambler was a symbol of temptation and transgression, a glittering warning wrapped in silk. Writers used her as shorthand for danger, from Richardson's trembling heroines to Sheridan's scheming ladies of leisure. Artists loved her. Moralists despised her. And audiences couldn't get enough. The aftermath for these women could be brutal. Some married their creditors, others fled abroad to escape them. A few, like the Duchess of Devonshire, recovered their dignity through politics or charm. Many vanished from society entirely, their stories ending not in duels or drama but in quiet poverty. The card tables that once glowed with laughter became empty relics of their downfall, monuments to charm, risk, and the eternal human ability to ruin oneself beautifully. In hindsight, these women were both victims and pioneers. They played a dangerous game in a world stacked against them, where every wager cost double and every mistake made headlines. Their salons were the precursors of modern social spaces, where women could assert power, even if that power was fleeting and expensive. Georgian men gambled for glory and called it sport. Georgian women gambled for freedom and called it scandal. Either way, the house and the gossip column always won. When Georgian gentlemen grew bored of losing money in London, they did what all self-respecting aristocrats did. They packed their trunks, kissed their creditors goodbye, and took their bad habits on tour. The Grand Tour, originally conceived as a noble journey of cultural refinement, quickly became a travelling circus of overindulgence. Britain's finest young men were sent to Europe to study art, philosophy, and architecture, and somehow returned fluent only in gambling, wine, and questionable French. The idea was noble in theory. A proper education, it was said, required exposure to the continent's great cities, Paris for Polish, Rome for antiquity, Venice for decadence. But by the mid-18th century, the Grand Tour had transformed from an educational pilgrimage into a roving casino, and wherever British travellers went, gambling followed like an unwelcome valet. Dice, cards, and bad decisions crossed borders with ease, uniting Europe under a single shared truth. The Englishman abroad could not be trusted near a gaming table. Nowhere did this phenomenon shine brighter, or burn poorer, than Paris. The French capital, already synonymous with luxury, was a paradise for the Georgian gambler. Its salons and private clubs offered an elegance London couldn't match, chandeliers glittering, perfume mingling with candle smoke, and conversation conducted in the universal language of risk. The French aristocracy played for honour. The British played for spectacle. To lose spectacularly was practically patriotic. Parisian gaming rooms became unofficial embassies of British ruin. English lords, barely out of Oxford, arrived armed with guineas, arrogance, and absolutely no restraint. They mingled with French nobles, drank heavily and bet lavishly, convinced that foreign luck might behave better than domestic. It did not. One French observer noted, "The English play as if they wish to prove fortune has limits." Another replied, "It appears she agrees with them, and yet these reckless tourists were adored, at least until their money ran out." French hosts found them entertaining, generous, and perfectly predictable. The moment a British noble entered the room, the odds improved for everyone else. There were even jokes in Parisian circles that an Englishman at the table is as good as a royal pension. Some gamblers went so far as to follow the young lords from salon to salon, scenting ruin like bloodhounds. If Paris was refined vice, Venice was glorious chaos. The lagoon city was Europe's glittering capital of chance, home to the infamous Ridotto, the world's first official public casino. Founded in 1638 but still thriving well into the Georgian era, the Ridotto was the temple of temptation where the mask was both fashion and strategy. Nobles, courtesans, diplomats and debtors all played beneath the same chandeliers, and English travellers adored it. Here, at last, they could gamble without the judgment of Parliament or parish. Visitors described the Venetian gambling halls as dreamlike. Rooms filled with masked figures speaking in whispers, tables crowded with cards and gold, music drifting in from distant canals. The anonymity was intoxicating. No titles, no gossip, just luck, or its crueler cousin. Many an English aristocrat left Venice lighter in purse and heavier in humiliation. One anonymous diarist lamented, "I came for Titian and lost 2 carriages and my dignity at Faro." But the British gambling diaspora didn't stop there. Rome offered quieter, more discreet indulgence. Private gaming salons disguised as cultural gatherings. Travellers could debate classical sculpture by day and wager on dice by night, satisfying both scholarship and sin. In Germany, spa towns like Baden-Baden and Wiesbaden lured English visitors with the promise of healthful waters and moderate games. Naturally, the water was ignored and the moderation drowned in champagne. These cross-border escapades soon became legendary and alarming. British newspapers began publishing stories of noble sons returning home broke, humiliated, and occasionally married to mysterious women named Countess something or other. Parents who had sent their heirs abroad to study Dante and Virgil received letters instead that read, "Request immediate funds, situation delicate, am currently in Venice, or perhaps Vienna." The education of taste turned out to be an expensive syllabus. The phenomenon became so common that foreign establishments catered specifically to British gamblers. Venetian bankers extended credit for gentlemen of distinction. Parisian hotels discreetly provided pawnbrokers on call. Even Rome's clergy supposedly offered spiritual consolation to those whose losses had become too divine to explain. Europe, ever adaptable, had turned British folly into a thriving export industry. Not everyone was amused. Moralists back home railed that the Grand Tour had become the grand temptation. Pamphlets warned anxious parents that sending their sons abroad was like handing a fox the keys to the henhouse. Satirists had a field day. Cartoons showed young lords kneeling before roulette wheels as if before pagan altars, sacrificing fortunes to the gods of chance. Playwrights mocked the continental gentleman, a hapless fool who could quote Voltaire in French but couldn't balance his own accounts. But beyond the humour lay a subtle truth. Gambling abroad wasn't merely vice, it was performance. For the Georgian elite, losing money in Venice or Paris carried a certain glamour that local ruin lacked. It was cosmopolitan failure, elegant self-destruction with a foreign accent. One diplomat summed it up perfectly. To lose at home is misfortune, and to lose abroad is experience. Of course, the debts followed them back across the Channel. Many returned to England with exquisite manners, exotic diseases, and creditors who spoke 3 languages. Customs officers inspecting their trunks found souvenirs, wine, and the occasional unopened art treatise, ironic evidence of the education they were supposed to have gained. The only thing they had truly mastered was the international language of financial regret. By the turn of the 19th century, as the Napoleonic Wars closed borders and travel grew perilous, the great age of the gambling Grand Tour came to an end. But its spirit, that intoxicating blend of arrogance, adventure and self-sabotage, lingered in British culture. The elite had discovered that no matter where they went, they carried their vices with them, neatly packed between their wigs and waistcoats. The Georgian aristocrat left Britain to seek refinement and returned fluent in Pharaoh, French, debt, and hangover cures. Truly, nothing spreads faster than bad habits with good luggage. The The Georgian gambling craze wasn't just a social epidemic, it was an economic event. Beneath the flicker of candlelight and the clatter of dice, a quiet revolution in money was taking place. Every ruined gentleman, every sold estate, every pawned necklace left a ripple in Britain's financial pond. Gambling didn't simply destroy fortunes, it redistributed them with ruthless efficiency. To understand Georgian gambling, one must imagine an 18th century economy where credit was as common as card tables, and reputation was the only collateral that mattered. Gold coins were scarce, but promises flowed freely. A nobleman could lose thousands in a single night without ever touching a guinea. IOUs, or promissory notes, circulated through the gaming world like polite curses. A gambler's handwriting was often more valuable than his land until it wasn't. This web of debt connected everyone, from the duke to the draper. When a nobleman gambled away his fortune, the effects didn't end at his dining table. They trickled downward. Servants went unpaid, tradesmen were stiffed, creditors panicked, and entire villages tied to the estate economy found themselves teetering on collapse. The glittering excess of Mayfair's gaming clubs was balanced by quiet misery in the countryside, where labourers wondered why their wages hadn't arrived. And yet, in true Georgian fashion, one man's ruin was another man's profit. Bankers and moneylenders became the hidden beneficiaries of the nation's addiction. London's financial elite, those polite, powdered figures haunting Lombard Street and Cornhill, discovered that gambling debts were astonishingly lucrative. After all, aristocrats might default on payments, but they rarely defaulted on their pride. A well-timed loan to a desperate lord could yield decades of interest, not to mention political influence. These financiers, often from the emerging middle class, learned to navigate the peculiar morality of high society lending. Officially, they disapproved of gambling. Privately, they financed it. They extended credit lines to known degenerates, accepted estates as collateral, and even attended gaming parties, not to play but to take notes. In some cases, entire properties were exchanged over cards before the ink on the mortgage had dried. Among the most infamous stories was that of Lord Sandwich, yes, the Earl who gave his name to your lunch, who once borrowed heavily to fund his gaming habits and paid back his debts and government favours. It was an elegant arrangement. The banker got influence, the lord kept his dignity, and Britain got yet another reason to distrust everyone in charge. Gambling also spurred an informal shadowed economy of credit and collateral. Pawnbrokers, money changers, and shady note discounters thrived in the gaps left by polite banking. These men, and occasionally women, turned desperation into business. They bought up IOUs for a fraction of their value, bullied or bribed the debtors, and resold the paper to investors. Gambling debts became commodities, bundled, traded, and speculated upon, much like the modern financial derivatives market. The only difference was that Georgian debt collectors occasionally used pistols instead of paperwork. Meanwhile, entire professions sprouted to service the gambler's lifestyle. Jewellers, silversmiths, tailors, and carriage makers depended on the whims of the wealthy. When a nobleman was flush with winnings, orders flowed freely. Diamond snuff boxes, imported lace, gilded tea sets, and experimental hairstyles large enough to defy physics. But when luck turned, and it always did, the same artisans found themselves with unpaid invoices and politely worded threats. Economic historians have joked that Georgian fashion was cyclical only because creditors kept repossessing the latest trends. At the macro level, the gambling economy mirrored Britain's broader transformation. The 18th century was an age of speculation, of bubbles and bursts. The South Sea bubble of 1720, when investors lost fortunes in a fraudulent trading company, was essentially gambling in powdered wigs. The same mentality that led gentlemen to bet on dice also led them to bet on phantom ships. When Parliament debated gambling reform decades later, one critic dryly noted that the government itself hath wagered the nation upon trade. It wasn't only men who played the financial game. Aristocratic women, too, became unwilling participants in the economy of ruin. When their husbands or brothers gambled away family fortunes, They often became the liquidators, selling jewels, dismissing servants, and negotiating with creditors. Some learned the art of quiet manipulation, securing small fortunes through social influence or advantageous marriages. Others simply disappeared into genteel poverty, victims of both patriarchy and poor odds. Yet for every tragedy, there was an opportunist waiting in the wings. Enter the new money class, the merchants and financiers who built their wealth by lending to gamblers and buying up their abandoned estates. Georgian England's rural landscape bears their fingerprints. Country houses once owned by blue-blooded families now belong to men whose fathers sold buttons or imported tea. Gambling didn't just ruin the aristocracy, it democratized ownership in the most chaotic way imaginable. By the century's end, the ripple effects of gambling were visible everywhere. The property market was flooded with repossessed estates. Auction houses overflowed with portrait silverware and furniture once belonging to the finest names in Britain. Debts had become the great leveller, reducing dukes to debtors and raising tradesmen to landowners. The new economy didn't care about lineage, it cared about liquidity. Some saw poetic justice in this redistribution of wealth. Moralists called it divine punishment, while economists called it market correction. Either way, Britain's obsession with risk reshaped its financial landscape. Gambling taught the nation two lessons. First, that money could move faster than morals, and second, that losing beautifully was almost as respectable as winning dishonestly. Perhaps the most enduring irony is that gambling's chaos helped modernise Britain's economy. The constant flow of IOUs, loans and mortgages forced financial institutions to evolve. Banks grew more sophisticated, credit more regulated, and paper money more common. In a twisted sense, the same vice that destroyed fortunes also built the foundations of modern capitalism. As one historian quipped, the Georgian aristocracy may have lost its estates, but in doing so it invented the mortgage. By 1800 the great gambling fortunes had been spent, but their ghosts lived on, in ledgers, interest rates, and the uneasy alliance between wealth and risk. The dice may have stopped rolling, but the economy they inspired never did. In the end, Georgian gambling proved that while luck is fleeting, debt is forever. And if you couldn't hold on to your fortune, the banker next door was happy to hold it for you. By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain had sobered up. The dice still rolled, but not as loudly. The clinking of guineas was replaced by the hiss of steam engines, and the raucous card tables of Georgian excess began to feel embarrassingly old-fashioned. The nation that once wagered its soul on chance was now more interested in railroads, reform and respectability. The gambling craze that had consumed an era didn't die, it simply evolved, swapped its silk waistcoats for waistcoats of discipline, and found new ways to lose money under the respectable label of enterprise. The Industrial Revolution was gambling's greatest rival. The age of invention demanded thrift, precision, and calculation, the very virtues the Georgians had spent a century avoiding. Fortunes were no longer built in gaming clubs, but in factories, banks, and trading companies. Men who once risked thousands on a roll of the dice now risk thousands on the expansion of a railway line or a shipment of cotton from India. In spirit, it was the same thrill, high stakes, high hopes, and very little sleep, but society preferred to call it business. The Victorians, with their endless appetite for moral order, looked back on the Georgian gambler with theatrical disapproval. To them, the 18th century was a cautionary tale in powdered wigs. Newspapers, novels, and sermons portrayed the Georgian gaming table as a den of vice, filled with cheating, drunkenness, and moral decay. The new century's heroes were not rakes and rogues, but industrialists and reformers, men who built empires of steel rather than chance. The cultural shift was profound, where Georgians had admired the boldness of a gambler. Victorians admired the restraint of a man who didn't play at all, or at least not publicly. But of course, restraint was mostly a rebranding exercise. The Victorian middle class had inherited the gambler's spirit. They just learned to disguise it in ledgers and stock reports. The gambling table became the stock exchange. The the deck of cards became investment certificates, and the dice evolved into share prices. When moralists declared that gambling was a sin, the bankers quietly nodded and invented speculation. The difference was merely one of vocabulary. Still, the public face of gambling changed dramatically. Gone were the extravagant gaming clubs and titled hostesses of the Georgian era. In their place came the discreet betting office, the private card room, and the occasional charity raffle thinly disguised as philanthropy. Parliament continued to tighten restrictions through a series of laws, the Gaming Acts of 1845 and 1853, which criminalised public gaming houses and outlawed betting in taverns. The government, in its wisdom, concluded that if gambling couldn't be eliminated, it could at least be hidden. Ironically, the very act of moral suppression only made gambling more secretive and alluring. Behind the proper facades of London's new townhouses, private clubs thrived. The heirs of the old Georgian elite still played cards, just now with quieter laughter and thicker curtains. The famous White's Club, once the playground of reckless dukes, survived by cultivating exclusivity rather than notoriety. One could still lose a small fortune there, but now it came with fine wine, polished etiquette, and plausible deniability. Meanwhile, gambling adapted to the new industrial rhythms of Britain. Horse racing, once an aristocrat's leisure, became the national sport of the working class. The factory worker who couldn't afford a club membership could still place a wager on Derby Day. Betting on horses, especially after the invention of the railway, exploded in popularity. Thousands travelled from city to countryside to cheer, jeer, and risk a week's wages on a horse named Moral Reform that usually finished last. The lottery, banned early in the century for its corruption, reappeared in spirit if not in name. Raffles, sweepstakes, and informal betting pools filled the gap. Even churches organised harmless draws to fund repairs, proof that moral consistency was, as ever, negotiable. One critic observed dryly, "We have abolished gambling by making it a Christian duty." For all its moralising, the Victorian age remained haunted by the ghosts of Georgian excess. The appetite for risk hadn't vanished. It had merely shifted arenas. Industrial capitalism, stock trading, colonial expansion, all were forms of gambling writ large. When men poured fortunes into railway companies that collapsed within months, nobody called it vice. It was entrepreneurial misfortune. As one cynic noted, a gambler who loses at cards is ruined. A gambler who loses at markets is knighted. This transformation reflected Britain's changing class structure. The 18th century gambler had been a product of aristocratic privilege. His ruin was personal, his debts theatrical. The 19th century gambler was a creature of modern capitalism, anonymous, efficient, and publicly moral. Where the Georgian rake gambled for amusement, the Victorian investor gambled for progress. And yet, at the core, both believed in the same fantasy, that fortune could be mastered, calculated, and bent to human will. The press, once gleefully obsessed with scandals of duchesses and dukes, shifted its moral outrage toward the working poor. Gambling among the lower classes became the new villain of reformers. Pamphlets warned that betting ruined families, distracted men from honest labour, and lured women into sin. Reform societies like the National Anti-Gambling League, founded later in the century, sought to save the poor from themselves, while quietly ignoring that the same wealthy industrialists funding them were speculating on global markets. The hypocrisy was so thick you could shuffle it. By the late 19th century, Britain's relationship with gambling had settled into a peculiar equilibrium. The wild public extravagance of the Georgian age had given way to a disciplined hypocrisy. Gambling never disappeared. It simply became a private vice and a public taboo. Cards were played in drawing rooms, bets whispered in gentlemen's clubs, and fortunes still lost, only now with ledgers to make it look respectable. In short, Britain didn't outgrow its gambling habit, it gentrified it. The stakes were higher, the players quieter, and the losses neatly recorded under business expenses. The Georgian gambler had once toasted the gods of chance. The Victorian investor prayed to the invisible hand of the market. Both were believers in the same church, only the hymns had changed. The Victorians claimed to ban gambling, then built an empire on it. The only difference between the gaming table and the stock exchange was better stationery, and a moral pamphlet on the way out. By the time the last Georgian candle flickered out, Britain had transformed from a nation of aristocratic risk-takers into an empire of financial gamblers. The powdered wigs were gone, but the spirit of the wager remained, refined, repackaged, and deeply embedded in the British bloodstream. The gambling tables of the 18th century didn't vanish into history, they evolved into something far more powerful, a national temperament that prized risk as progress, chance as opportunity, and profit as virtue. The story of Britain's gambling legacy is, in many ways, the story of its modern economy. The same people who once bet on dice and horses began betting on ships, factories, and futures. The speculative energy that fueled London's gaming clubs didn't die, it was simply rerouted into the veins of capitalism. The polite exchange of cards and coins gave birth to the London Stock Exchange, where fortunes still rise and fall daily, only now with coffee instead of claret, and with slightly fewer duels. The link between gambling and finance was not accidental. Georgian gambling normalised the culture of credit, the belief that debt could be both tool and weapon. The IOUs once scribbled in candlelit clubs evolved into bonds, shares, and investment contracts. Those who once wagered on luck now wagered on markets. The concept of speculation became socially acceptable when dressed in the language of enterprise. A man who risked his fortune at cards was reckless. A man who risked it on trade was visionary. The boundary between vice and vision, as always, depended on presentation. Even Britain's financial institutions owe part of their DNA to the era of ruinous wagers. The growing complexity of gambling debts forced bankers and solicitors to invent new systems of record-keeping, notarization, and collateral management. It was from the ashes of noblemen's IOUs that modern credit reporting and contractual law began to take shape. The banker became the new bookmaker, and the odds, as ever, were in his favour. But the Georgian gambling legacy wasn't just financial, it was psychological. It created an addictive optimism, a belief that fortune favoured the bold, that risk was not folly but destiny. This cultural confidence, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous, became the engine of British expansion, propelled explorers across oceans, entrepreneurs into factories, and politicians into colonies they had no business ruling. The British Empire, one might argue, was the largest gamble in human history. An audacious, globe-spanning bet that paid off for a while, before the house, history collected. That same risk-loving mindset also shaped British innovation. The Industrial Revolution thrived not on certainty, but on speculation. Inventors and investors shared the same gambler's soul, daring, impatient, occasionally delusional. James Watt bet on steam, George Stephenson on steel rails, Brunel on tunnels under rivers. Each was staking reputation and fortune on untested machines, and occasionally losing both. Yet failure was tolerated, even admired. As one 19th century financier put it, Britons prefer a man who risks too much to one who risks nothing. Culturally, the residue of Georgian gaming found its way into language and literature. The vocabulary of gambling, stakes, odds, risk, bluff, play your cards right, became shorthand for ambition and fate. Writers from Dickens to Thackeray to Trollope laced their novels with the imagery of chance, mirroring a society that had never quite shaken the thrill of uncertainty. Dickens, ever the moralist, saw in gambling the perfect metaphor for Victorian hypocrisy, a nation that condemned the gaming table while betting its future on empire and industry. Even Britain's politics carried echoes of the old gaming spirit. Parliamentary manoeuvring was often described in the language of risk and reward, playing one's hand, doubling down, losing the lot. The Georgian aristocrats who once gambled away estates had descendants who gambled with policies, alliances and empires. The stakes had changed, but the instincts remained eerily familiar. And then there's the national character. That curious mix of stoicism and daring that defines the British myth. The calm face at the poker table, the stiff upper lip in defeat, the cheerful toast to disaster, all trace their roots to those smoky rooms of chance where dignity mattered more than solvency. Losing gracefully became a virtue, winning without boasting an art form. It's not about the money, the Georgian gambler would say, moments before losing it all. And in that lie was the seed of British understatement. Even in the modern age, the echoes of the Georgian gamble linger. The 20th century replaced faro tables with football pools and casino chips with stock portfolios, but the national love affair with risk never waned. When the global financial markets rose and fell on speculation, Britain felt oddly at home. The skyscrapers of Canary Wharf, filled with men in tailored suits making million-pound bets with keystrokes, are the direct descendants of Brooks Club, only now with faster champagne delivery and better ventilation. Psychologists might call it a cultural addiction, a need for uncertainty dressed up as ambition. Historians might call it evolution, the transformation of aristocratic recklessness into capitalist ingenuity. Either way, the Georgian gambler's ghost still haunts the British psyche. Charming, reckless, eternally confident that the next hand will turn things around. The irony, of course, is that the Georgians' greatest gamble wasn't financial at all. It was moral. They bet that a society built on excess could survive long enough to learn moderation. And astonishingly, it did. The legacy of their gamble wasn't destruction, but endurance. Britain learned to live with risk, to institutionalise it, to monetize it, even to celebrate it. The same passion that once emptied pockets built railways, ships and stock empires. In the end, the Georgian gambling craze didn't die, it matured. The country that once lost fortunes in drawing rooms now moves them invisibly across digital ledgers. The aristocrat who once rolled dice under chandeliers has become the trader in a pinstripe suit, watching numbers flicker on a glowing screen. Different tools, same thrill. The Georgians may have gambled away their estates, but they left Britain with something better, a national pastime. We still roll the dice, only now we call it the economy.